Only after the suction force from the current step had been weakened to a certain degree did he take another step, only to be forced to pause again before continuing onward. Thus, the final dozen or so steps took Han Li close to 10 minutes to scale. As soon as he set foot onto the mountain summit, the suction force from the stone steps completely vanished, and his body became light as a feather, making him feel as if he could fly even without using any magic power. After heaving a sigh of relief, the blurry suit of golden armor around his body vanished in a flash. He turned back to find that Shi Kun was still several hundred steps away, looking up at Han Li with a dejected expression while panting heavily. As for Liu Shuyer, she was still more than 2,000 steps away, and from Han Li's perspective, she was only a small black dot in the distance. The only consolation for them was that even though Han Li had scaled the stone steps first, the Purple Palace was extremely massive and potentially contained some powerful restrictions as well, so they didn't have to worry about him taking all of the treasures in there. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face as he turned around before casting his gaze toward the Purple Palace. Several hundred feet away from him, there stood a massive gate that was over 200 feet tall. The gate was tightly shut, and there were several tens of large stones of different colors embedded onto its surface. Around these stones were a series of complex patterns, and the stones seemed to have been placed in a certain sequence. After taking a careful glance at the palace gate, he was shocked to discover that all of the fist-sized stones embedded onto the palace gate were top-grade spirit stones that were clearly even purer than the top-grade spirit stones in the spirit realm. Han Li clicked his tongue with wonder as he shifted his gaze over to the purple wall beside the gate. The walls had been constructed from an unidentifiable material, and they only stood around 50 to 60 feet tall. However, they were emanating a strange light, and there were silver runes of different sizes carved onto their surfaces. Han Li was immediately able to identify those runes as beveled silver text. So this place really was constructed by a true immortal. Han Li seemed to be quite calm on the outside, but there was a scorching look in his eyes as he appraised the palace. He possessed several extraordinary treasures and had encountered all types of miraculous opportunities during his cultivation journey. But the thought of being able to explore a palace left behind by a true immortal still filled him with irrepressible excitement. It was no wonder that Kai Ling and Duan Tianren were convinced that there were pills in there that could help them break through their holy race bottlenecks. Considering how unfathomably powerful true immortals were, it was naturally a simple task for them to refine pills that could be immensely beneficial to beings of a lower realm. Han Li took a deep breath to calm himself down before casting his gaze up toward the purple palace walls again. All of a sudden, he raised a hand and pointed a finger upward, upon which an arc of golden lightning shot forth amid a resounding thunderclap, hurtling toward the air above the palace walls. A peculiar turn of events immediately unfolded. There seemed to be nothing but empty air above the palace walls, but as soon as the golden arc of lightning struck the empty space, a burst of delightful heavenly music suddenly rang out, following which purple light flashed, and the golden lightning vanished like a sandcastle in the rising tide. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this, and even after immediately activating his bright-sight spirit eyes, he was still unable to identify what was so special about that purple light. He then tried to use his spiritual sense to assess the situation, only for it to be repelled by a burst of invisible force as soon as it reached close to the palace walls, thereby making it impossible for him to detect what lay within those walls. After heaving a faint sigh, Han Li gave up on trying to cross over the palace walls and cast his gaze toward the gate again. Compared to braving the mysterious restriction on the palace walls, it was clearly a much safer option to try and enter through the gate. However, even though he couldn't sense anything amiss just by looking at the palace gate, he naturally wasn't going to try and open it on his own. After a brief pause, Han Li patted the storage bracelet on his wrist, upon which a ball of azure light immediately flew forth from within before thudding heavily onto the ground. This was a giant ape puppet that was around 20 feet tall, and it lay sprawled on the ground, having clearly been impacted quite heavily by the flight restriction. Han Li raised an eyebrow upon seeing this, then made a hand seal before pointing at the puppet in a nonchalant manner. The giant ape puppet slowly got up at his behest, then turned around expressionlessly before making its way toward the palace gate. Meanwhile, Han Li stood still on the spot, appraising the puppet intently through narrowed eyes. After arriving before the palace gate, the giant ape puppet raised its hands without any hesitation before pressing them against the massive gate. Azure light flashed erratically around the puppet's body, following which the gate was slowly pushed open. Han Li was quite surprised to see this, and he was both elated but also in disbelief. How could the palace gate have been opened so easily? With that in mind, he forcibly repressed the confusion and impatience in his heart as he hurriedly cast his gaze beyond the entrance. Thus, he was greeted by the sight of a plaza that was entirely paved with azure tiles and fenced by translucent white jade structures. On the other end of the plaza was a tall main palace that was also purple in color. From afar, Han Li could also see that there were also 3 side palaces near the main palace, each of which was only around a third of the size of the main palace. These side palaces were situated in a triangular formation with the main palace at the center. Aside from that, there were also some short buildings and pavilions behind the main palace, and this place seemed to span quite a vast area. After a brief hesitation, he transmitted an instruction to the puppet using his spiritual sense, upon which it made its way into the palace through the main gate. And Li also slowly followed along behind it. After a while, he found himself on the other side of the city gate, and he quickly arrived at one corner of the plaza. The plaza appeared to be around 5,000 to 6,000 feet in size, and the giant ape puppet continued onward at Han Li's behest, preparing to pass directly through the plaza en route to the main palace up ahead. Han Li continued to trail along behind the puppet, maintaining a distance of around 200 feet from it in case any unforeseen mishaps occurred. However, a peculiar expression soon appeared on Han Li's face. This was only a plaza that was several thousand feet in size, yet even after walking for so long, the puppet still hadn't even made it to the center of the plaza. This is an illusionary formation. Han Li's eyes narrowed as he instructed the puppet to stop, then turned around to cast his gaze behind him. In his mind, he had already walked for around 3,000 to 4,000 feet, yet he appeared to be only just over 100 feet away from the corner of the plaza that he'd started from. Han Li was slightly alarmed to see this, and blue light immediately flashed through his eyes as he cast his gaze around the entire plaza. However, even after using his spirit eye ability, he was unable to detect anything amiss. Han Li's expression changed slightly upon seeing this. This was the first time that his spirit eye ability had ever failed to see through an illusionary formation, but taking into consideration the fact that this restriction had most likely been set up by a true immortal, this development wasn't actually all that surprising. Even so, Han Li wasn't intending to give up just like that. After taking a deep breath, he began to circulate all of the magic power within his entire body, then directed it toward his glabella. A ball of black chi immediately materialized in front of his glabella, following which a third demonic eye appeared in a flash. This was none other than the Law Destruction Eye that Han Li had already nurtured for several centuries. Han Li had possessed this third eye ever since he was back in the human world, and after so many years had passed, it had developed some uncanny abilities. Even though this eye's forte lay in spatial abilities, it also possessed some abilities that could specifically target illusionary techniques and other types of restrictions. But the effects of those abilities naturally weren't as potent as those of his bright-sight spirit eyes. After arriving at the Thunder Continent, Han Li had unintentionally discovered, while cultivating in seclusion, that his bright-sight spirit eyes and Law Destruction Eye could be combined to unleash a new ability, one that was far superior to any of the abilities that either one of his spirit eyes possessed. Even though this ability was quite powerful, it required a considerable amount of magic power expenditure to be unleashed, and this was the first time Han Li had ever used it in a practical setting. However, thinking back to the scenes that unfolded the last time he trialed this ability, he was quite confident that it would be able to break through the illusionary formation that he was in. As such, he immediately began to chant something, and the blue light in his eyes gradually became more and more pronounced. At the same time, black light began to swirl within his Law Destruction Eye, making it appear as if there was a shimmering black gem lodged on his forehead. All of a sudden, 2 streaks of blue light and a pillar of black light shot forth from his 3 spirit eyes in unison, and they combined as one to form a black and blue ball of light. This was a translucent fist-sized ball of light with a blue exterior and a black center, making it appear as if it was a massive eyeball. Break! Han Li immediately swept a sleeve toward the ball of light, and a burst of azure light surged forth from within before vanishing into the ball of light in a flash. spiritual light flashed from the surface of the ball of light, following which black and blue runes of different sizes emerged before rapidly revolving through the air. All of a sudden, countless threads of black and blue light shot forth from the ball of light, flying away in all directions. These threads of light were extremely thin and traveled at astonishing speeds, spreading over the entire plaza in the blink of an eye before forming a massive black and blue net that encompassed the entirety of the plaza beneath it. In the next instant, dull thumps rang out from all over the plaza as balls of light of different colors exploded beneath the massive net. A burst of spatial fluctuations then erupted into the heavens as the space beneath the net twisted and warped. Immediately thereafter, the center of the plaza blurred before a door of white light emerged. Han Li's expression changed slightly upon seeing this, and he immediately vanished on the spot as a blurry shadow. In the next instant, he reappeared directly in front of the door of light before disappearing into it. The giant ape puppet also hurriedly followed along. Almost as soon as the puppet entered the door of light, the black and blue ball of light that was hovering in midair abruptly exploded. The giant net that had encompassed the entire plaza also shattered without any warning before dissipating as specks of spiritual light. In the next instant, white light flashed erratically from the door of light, and the surrounding space blurred before it also vanished. Thus, the plaza was restored to its original appearance, but Han Li and the giant ape puppet were nowhere to be seen. It was as if they'd never even entered the palace in the first place. Meanwhile, Kun was only just over 100 steps away from reaching the summit, and he could already catch a glimpse of the entrance of the palace. Liu Shuyer was a few hundred steps behind him, and the two of them seemed to have calmed down now that Han Li had already entered the palace ahead of them. Han Li reopened his eyes and immediately appraised his surroundings. After emerging from the door of light, he found himself situated directly in front of the main palace. The gate of the main palace was rather mundane-looking, with only a few simple patterns engraved onto its surface. However, there was a giant plaque that was around 70 to 80 feet in length hanging above the gate, and there were a few ancient golden characters inscribed on its surface. Han Li focused his gaze on the plaque, and his heart stirred slightly in response to what he saw. Even though he couldn't read this ancient text, it struck him as being rather similar to beveled silver text, so it was most likely golden seal text. Unfortunately, there were extremely few beings in the spirit realm that understood golden seal text, so he hadn't been able to learn it from anywhere. Otherwise, perhaps he'd be able to glean some useful information from this plaque. With that in mind, Han Li cast his gaze toward the gate in front of him before issuing another instruction to the giant ape puppet, beside him using his spiritual sense. The puppet immediately stepped forward at his behest, making its way up the stairs, then pressing its hands against the gates of the main palace to try and push it open, just as it had done with the previous palace gate. However, things didn't progress as smoothly on this occasion. As soon as the giant ape puppet's hands came into contact with the mundane-looking gate, a string of dull thunderclaps suddenly rang out. Immediately thereafter, a devastating aura that threatened to annihilate heaven and earth erupted from the gate. Even though Han Li was over 100 feet away from the gate, he was still quite alarmed by this sudden development, and he immediately conjured up a set of azure and white lightning robes around his body. His upper body then twisted around, and even though his lower body remained completely still, he was somehow able to slide toward the side in a wraith-like manner. Almost at the exact same moment, a burst of dazzling purple light flashed from the gate of the main palace. Arcs of purple lightning then erupted from its surface, hurtling forth several tens of purple lightning snakes. The giant ape puppet was inundated by this purple lightning in a flash, and was instantly reduced to nothingness. However, the arcs of purple lightning showed no signs of stopping there. After destroying the giant ape puppet, they changed directions and surged directly toward Han Li as if they had a mind of their own. Han Li's expression changed drastically upon seeing this. If there were no flight restrictions in place, he'd naturally be able to unleash his movement techniques to evade this lightning. However, seeing as he was unable to rise up into the air, there was no way for him to dodge this attack no matter how agile he was. In this dire situation, Han Li hurriedly raised a hand to summon a small crystalline shield. The small shield then expanded to around 10 feet in size amid a flash of spiritual light, following which a burst of black chi erupted from Han Li's body. A suit of sinister-looking devilish armor quickly emerged beneath the layer of azure and white lightning around his body, and it was none other than the repaired heavenly devilish armor. Purple lightning flashed, and all of the purple snakes struck the giant shield with immense power. This crystalline shield was able to refract light-based attacks, and it had saved Han Li on many occasions. However, the situation on this occasion turned out to be vastly different. These purple arcs of lightning were clearly different from normal lightning, as the giant crystalline shield was only able to refract about a third of the arcs of lightning, while the majority of the barrage continued onward to strike the shield. Purple lightning exploded, and the giant shield was immediately inundated by a terrifying scorching aura. Incredible scene then ensued. The crystalline shield quickly began to melt in the face of the arcs of purple lightning, and it was reduced to a puddle of translucent liquid that dripped down onto the ground below. Han Li was quite stunned to see this, and he immediately made a hand seal, upon which the lightning robe around his body erupted forth as an azure and white net of lightning that intertwined with the purple lightning. The arcs of lightning formed by the lighting robe were manifested from the tribulation lightning that Han Li had collected, so they were naturally far more powerful than normal lightning. However, they were no match for the arcs of purple lightning. As soon as the two clashed, the azure and white arcs of lightning instantly shrank before vanishing as if they had been devoured by the arcs of purple lightning, thereby fueling the purple snakes rather than nullifying their powers. Han Li's face paled upon seeing this, and he hurriedly swept both sleeves through the air, unleashing thick bolts of golden lightning that surged forth amid rumbling thunderclaps. However, he was already too late, and the purple snakes suddenly combined to form several bolts of purple lightning with diameters comparable to that of large bowls before viciously striking Han Li's heavenly devilish armor. An earth-shattering boom erupted as Han Li stumbled back, while his entire body was enveloped by golden lightning. He immediately let loose a low cry of fury as his suit of devilish armor swelled in size, while the patterns on its surface also emerged as if they'd sprung to life, forming countless black runes that clashed with the arcs of purple lightning. Contrary to their appearance, these mundane-looking runes were extremely powerful, and as soon as they clashed with the arcs of purple lightning, both exploded into gusts of scorching black and purple winds that revolved around Han Li in a frenzy. When Han Li finally managed to arrest his momentum and steady himself, not only had the purple arcs of lighting disappeared, the gusts of scorching winds around him had also abruptly vanished. Han Li heaved a long sigh of relief and looked down at his suit of heavenly devilish armor with a hint of lingering fear in his eyes. That surprise attack wouldn't have been able to kill him, but without this suit of devilish armor, severe injuries would have been unavoidable. Even though he'd managed to survive that ordeal unscathed, he was still left in quite a disheveled state. Han Li heaved a faint sigh as he looked down at the puddle of translucent liquid on the ground with a wistful expression. The crystalline shield had clearly been completely and utterly destroyed, so there was no way for him to possibly repair it. After that, Han Li cast his gaze toward the gate of the main palace in a calm manner, and a hesitant look appeared in his eyes. Such a powerful restriction to have been placed on this gate clearly indicated that there had to be treasures in there that the true immortal owner of this place held in very high regard. Even if he could break such a fearsome restriction, it would definitely take him a long time to do so, and if Shi Kun and Liu Shuyer were to get here during that time, all of his efforts could potentially benefit them instead. As such, it simply wasn't worth it for him to persist with this main palace. Having made up his mind, Han Li immediately turned away without any hesitation and strode along a nearby path toward the closest side palace. Even if restrictions had also been set up on these side palaces, they definitely wouldn't be as fearsome as the one on the main palace, so there was a good chance that he'd be able to break them in a short time. As he traveled rapidly toward a side palace, he swept a sleeve through the air, and a ball of azure light flew out from within as he summoned another giant ape puppet. Having learned his lesson from last time, Han Li summoned this puppet very close to the ground, so it wasn't as heavily affected by the flight restriction. Thus, the second puppet made a smooth landing before passing Han Li as it rushed toward the side palace. Han Li followed along behind it in an expressionless manner, and no further mishaps occurred along the way as the two of them arrived safely before the side palace. Aside from the fact that this side palace was only around a third of the size of the main palace, the two were completely identical in appearance. It simply seemed to be a scaled-down version of the main palace, and there was also a plaque above the gate with golden seal text inscribed upon it. Han Li's eyelids twitched involuntarily at the sight of the mundane-looking gate, and after a brief pause, he retreated until he was around 400 feet away from the gate before finally drawing to a halt. After that, he raised a hand to produce several talismans, all of which he quickly plastered onto his own body. Several layers of protective spiritual light of different colors instantly appeared in quick succession. Immediately thereafter, Han Li made a hand seal with each of his hands, and golden lightning began to flash within both of his sleeves. After adopting all of these defensive measures, Han Li transmitted an instruction to the puppet using his spiritual sense with a grim expression on his face. The giant ape puppet immediately stepped forward, raising its arms before pressing its hands against the gate before it. Han Li looked on with bated breath, only for the gate to be slowly pushed open without a hitch. It seemed that no restrictions had been placed on this gate. Han Li was naturally ecstatic to see this, but as a safety precaution, he urged the puppet to make its way into the side palace first. Thus, the giant ape puppet walked into the palace and no mishaps occurred. Only then did Han Li heave a faint sigh of relief as the protective layers of spiritual light around his body vanished in a flash. At the same time, he quickly clenched his fists, and the golden lightning in his sleeves also disappeared in a soundless manner. After that, he quickly made his way into the side palace. After arriving in the side palace, the giant ape puppet was already standing beside the entrance in a completely motionless manner. Han Li quickly cast his gaze around the palace, and a hint of surprise appeared on his face in response to what he saw. At the center of the palace was a giant table that was as pristine white as jade, and a shimmering purple shrine stood on the table, within which was a blurry and indistinct deity statue. Across from the statue were hundreds of yellow futons, and on top of that, there was an azure incense burner positioned at each of the four corners of the palace. The faint scent of sandalwood wafted throughout the entire room. The place appeared to be a Buddhist temple. The area wasn't small. There was even a small gate to either side, each a passage to a different area. Han Li quickly swept his gaze past the large hall and eventually looked at the 2 rows of wooden cabinets. The wooden cabinets were white as snow and faintly released threads of icy chi. They were made from the snow wood famous throughout the spirit realm. The wood was an ideal material to refine ice-attributed treasures, but here it was being used as the material for a common cabinet. This was so extravagant, it left Han Li speechless. The cabinets had a dozen various colored tools laid on top of them. From a distance, he could see scepters, alms bowls, small bells, and other items. Han Li narrowed his eyes and his spiritual senses swept past the objects. After a brief moment of shock, delight beamed from his face. The tools possessed astonishing spiritual chi, every one of them a top-grade, half-finished treasure. If the original master refined them fully, they would be considered common spirit treasures at the very least, if not divine spirit treasures. Most importantly, from the outer appearance of the treasures, he knew they were obscure treasures of extraordinary abilities. Even if he spent the effort to truly refine them completely, their effectiveness would still be as powerful as treasures refined by their original master. In this case, they could be considered top-grade treasures of the spirit realm. Han Li shook his sleeve and suddenly, a wave of azure mist flew out and swept over the area, sweeping up every last treasure. After acquiring so many powerful treasures, Han Li felt delighted. After looking past the hall once more, he slowly lowered his head and looked at one of the mats several times. Suddenly, he let out a yelp as if he discovered something. He immediately swiped his hand out the ground. Whoosh! The mat silently entered his grasp. Not only did he find it flexible as water and numbing to the touch, but he sensed a wave of spiritual chi suddenly blow past him. This is, Han Li's eye flickered. The mat was clearly refined from some sort of spirit grass. It survived an unknown number of years, yet it was still brimming with spiritual chi. His expression stirred as if he had discovered something. Suddenly, he placed the mat underneath his nose and took a sniff, catching a faintly fishy scent. Han Li's face turned off and he flipped his other hand. In an azure flash, a meter-long sword appeared in his hand. He flung it at the mat and shook his wrist, chopping at it with a streak of swordlight. An astonishing scene occurred. The swordlight sliced atop the mat with seemingly unstoppable force and entered several inches deep before being firmly deflected. Yellow light roamed across the surface of the light and restored the cut damage from the sword. The grass alone had blocked the strike from the bamboo cloudswarm sword. Han Li flipped the mat several times and muttered, "This must be the legendary cloth armor grass. It is a truly fantastical item. The grass by itself is capable of blocking the strikes of blade-type magic treasures. If turned into armor, it'll be a top-grade defense. It is a pity that it's deeply vulnerable to fire-attributed attack. This is truly an immortal's residence. They use such a vastly important material as a mere mat. Since he's discovered the mat's value, he naturally wouldn't leave it there. He promptly stretched out a pitch-black palm from his sleeve, and he casually grasped towards the ground. A gray wave of light soon rolled across it. As gray light flickered, hundreds of mats silently vanished from the ground, sweeping the entire hall clear. When his spiritual sense swept through the storage pouch and saw the mats neatly arranged, he nodded with satisfaction. Since the grass has long been extinct in the spirit realm, the mats alone made the trip worth it. With that thought, Han Li let out a long sigh and took a deep breath. For some reason, he felt the scent of the sandalwood seemed to have grown denser. Sandalwood. He suddenly turned his head, and his eyes lit up as he quickly looked at the incense burner at the corner of the room. The incense stick in the burner was burned halfway, and its color was a faint yellow. It was unknown how long it was placed there. Han Li's brow stirred and he took large strides towards the corner. But before he arrived, he had already looked at the incense burner with his spiritual sense and immediately frowned. Surprisingly, the incense burner was made out of common bronze. It couldn't be considered a magic tool. Han Li blinked and he already walked in front of the incense burner. He then lowered his head and looked at the remaining third of the burning incense stick. A rich scent was leaking from the stick. The stick appeared to be more than meets the eye. From its appearance, it was no different from a common incense stick. But since it was able to retain a dense fragrance after so much time had passed, it must be extraordinary. Han Li looked at it for a long while, and his face turned grim. He raised his hand and reached out to extinguish the burning incense, but before he touched it, spiritual light flashed, and a layer of azure light wrapped around his fingers. With extreme care, he put out the tip of the burning incense and nothing happened. However, Han Li's expression still remained odd. He sternly looked at the incense several more times and took a long sniff before wearing a pensive face. Suddenly, he flicked his finger and red light flashed. A rice-sized star shot out from his fingertips and struck the end of the incense stick. As the light faded away, the incense wasn't reignited. Han Li narrowed his eyes, faintly betraying a trace of excitement. He flicked his finger again, and a crimson fireball shot out from the tip of his finger. It floated motionlessly in the air. When the fireball struck the end of the incense stick, he stared in silence. As a result, the scorching flames hadn't burned the incense stick in the slightest. As expected, it's the serene blackest incense. It wards off one's inner demons when breaking through to the body integration stage. When Han Li saw this, he wore a face of delight. He promptly flipped his hand, and a pure white jade box appeared in his hand. He carefully put the stick into his hand. Afterwards, his body shifted as he looked for the other half-burned incense stick at the other corners of the hall. With that said, he summoned a jade box in his hand with a flicker, and it completely vanished. Afterwards, Han Li took another look throughout the hall. It was a pity there were many things there to begin with. Apart from the shrine and the withered spirit fruits offered to the shrine, there was nothing else. With that, he eventually took a look at the shrine. Purple light shimmered from the shrine, and it appeared 3 meters tall. It contained the statue of a god, as if it had been carved from top-grade jade. The god statue wore green robes and held a snow-white horsetail whisk in one hand and a purple gourd in the other. He had a long beard and mustache trailing down his chin, giving him a faintly immortal aura. However, Han Li simply looked at the god statue for a short moment more, and he couldn't help but betray his shock. He suddenly discovered that no matter how long he stared at the statue's face, he could only see a haze of glimmering green light in front of it. He hadn't been able to perceive the statue's true appearance. Suddenly, he narrowed his eyes and blue light soon shined from them. He then forcefully peered at the god statue's face. It did have an effect. He gradually saw through green light mist covering the statue's face and saw it thin out. His mood lit up and his gaze grew focused, wanting to look at the god statue's face. But before he could see the finger details, a heavenly sound and a Buddhist chant rang through his mind. As his ears rang, his entire spiritual sense was thrown into disarray. Han Li's eyes turned black and he staggered to the ground. He took a seat, nearly dazed. Fortunately, his spiritual sense was comparable to body integration-grade cultivators. After hastily circulating the great development arts through his body, he eventually regained clarity of mind and stood back up. After straightening himself, he took another look at the god statue with bewilderment. The god statue was so strange. Even given his current cultivation stage, he wasn't able to see its true appearance. The statue itself was a grand treasure of immeasurable power. Since it was enshrined, the statue must have been modeled after an important figure even in the true immortal realm. The god statue was an immensely profound object. Even a few vastly powerful individuals in the spirit realm drew the support of god statues to manifest the primal soul or soul fragment from a deity an unfathomable distance away. Even though it had never been heard of for an immortal of the true immortal realm to use such a method to descend into the spirit realm, taking this god statue would definitely be unwise if it really were modeled after an important figure of the true immortal realm. Han Li's expression wavered for a long while before he eventually took a deep breath. After forcefully suppressing his desires, he looked away from the shrine and to a door at the side. His body stirred and he walked over without any further hesitation, and with a mental command, the huge ape puppet followed after him. Soon, all that was left in the hall was the lone shrine. At that moment, Han Li already walked through a passage and arrived in front of a dozen side rooms. The rooms didn't appear very large and they all appeared identical. Han Li quickly looked at them and had the huge ape puppet open the doors to the rooms one by one. When he saw that nothing happened, he began to flicker and enter each of the rooms. The interior was very simple. There was a small door that separated the rectangular room into two sections. The outer section was the larger one of the two, and it was clearly a guest hall, which was completely empty aside from a simple table and some chairs, as well as a tea set. Han Li swept his spiritual sense over these items to find that the materials used for them were all quite precious, but they were completely useless to him. Thus, he continued onward without pause, stepping into the inner section, which appeared to be a bedroom. There were slightly more items in this room. Aside from a faint green jade bed, there was also a rectangular desk, upon which were placed several writing brushes, a faint red inkstone, and a pile of thin snowy white silk-like sheets. Han Li's raised an eyebrow as he strode over to the desk. He picked up the writing brushes and inkstone one after another before giving them a quick inspection, but he then shook his head before putting them down again. After that, he reached out to grab the thin silk sheets before gently spreading them open, only to find that they were completely blank and devoid of any writing. Han Li's expression remained unchanged upon seeing this. He placed the silk sheets back to their original spot, then carefully swept his spiritual sense through the entire room again to make sure that he wasn't missing anything before immediately departing. This was clearly the living quarters for a disciple, so he didn't have high hopes that he would discover anything useful here anyway. As such, he naturally wasn't going to linger here for too long. Furthermore, there were over 10 rooms that were similar to this one, and he was on a tight schedule, so he couldn't conduct thorough investigations of all of these rooms. Thus, Han Li quickly searched through the dozen or so rooms, but didn't reap any worthwhile rewards for his efforts aside from a few jade slips, which had an unknown ancient scripture inscribed upon them. These jade slips had only been casually placed on a bedside table, so they most likely weren't important anyway. Han Li had only picked them up as an afterthought, thinking that he could perhaps glean some useful information from them if he were to decipher this ancient text someday. After all, he was very curious about everything in the true, immortal realm. He returned to the main hall with his puppet, then immediately strode through the side door on the other wall. After passing through another passageway, Han Li found himself standing in front of another orderly row of cabins. These cabins were completely different from the rooms he'd just visited. Each cabin was completely square and angular in shape, with a small door and no windows. Furthermore, all of the cabins were completely independent from one another, with a distance of over 100 feet between each cabin. What especially drew Han Li's attention was that the surfaces of these cabins were all shimmering with silver light and inscribed with faint silver runes, which were none other than the beveled silver text that he was now extremely familiar with. Han Li stared at these cabins for a while before finally ascertaining that these were secret chambers specifically designated for cultivation. This was quite an encouraging discovery to him, as it was very possible that there could be things left behind in these secret chambers by the people who had cultivated inside them in the past. However, a slightly grave look then appeared on his face at the sight of the finely inscribed silver runes on the doors of the cabins. Generally speaking, restrictions and formations that were set up on secret chambers were ones that isolated sound and kept out spiritual sense. However, with the terrifying ordeal he had suffered at the gate of the main palace earlier, he naturally wasn't going to take things lightly. On this occasion, he didn't spur on his giant ape puppet to test anything. Instead, he set up a few layers of defenses over his own body, then swept a sleeve directly toward the stone door of one of the secret chambers. A small azure sword shot forth, then transformed into an azure streak of light that was around 10 feet in length before striking the door in a vicious manner. He was immediately resorting to brute force to try and force his way through the restrictions on the door. Brilliant silver light radiated from the door, and a crisp ringing sound erupted from within the secret chamber. The silver light appeared to be quite ordinary, but it was able to keep out his azure bamboo cloudswarm sword. It was as if the streak of sword chi had struck a body of water and was completely unable to break through the silver light. It was only able to slowly wear down this spiritual light. However, Han Li was quite relieved to see this. Just he had expected, the restrictions on the door weren't capable of retaliation. Furthermore, they were most likely restrictions of a very low caliber in the true immortal realm. That made sense, considering that this was a row of a dozen or so secret cultivation chambers lined up next to one another. Why would anyone set up powerful restrictions on this cluster of buildings? With that in mind, he no longer hesitated as he flipped a hand over to produce a tiny black mountain that was around several inches tall, then tossed it forward. The mountain immediately expanded to around 10 feet in size amid a flash of black light, then struck the silver light in a vicious manner. The restriction on the door was clearly unable to withstand such an enormous impact, and the clear ringing sound immediately cut off while the silver light instantly dissipated. Azure light flashed, and the stone door was sliced in half by the azure sword chi before the two halves of the door fell to either side. Han Li stowed away his treasures before quickly striding into the room. The secret chamber was only around 70 to 80 feet in size, and the interior was completely empty aside from a futon that had also been woven from cloth armor grass. As such, there wasn't even any need for him to use his spiritual sense to detect anything. Thus, he could only heave a faint sigh and exit this secret chamber after picking up the futon. However, there were many such secret chambers in this area, so he wasn't actually all that disappointed. He used the same method to break through one stone door after another before entering the secret chambers, only to quickly emerge empty-handed every time. After breaking into 6 secret chambers in a row, Han Li still hadn't discovered anything of note, and he was internally lamenting his bad luck. At the same time, his expectations for the remaining secret chambers had also dwindled significantly. However, after the door of the 7th secret chamber was broken amid a resounding boom, his eyes immediately lit up as he strode into the chamber. This secret chamber was slightly different from its previous counterparts. Not only was there a table and chairs in the room, there were also 3 jade boxes of different sizes on the tables, as well as a pair of small vials. Furthermore, the thing that drew his attention the most was a piece of shimmering golden artwork that was hanging on the wall. This piece of artwork was radiating dazzling golden light, rendering him unable to glean its true contents. Han Li closed his eyes momentarily before abruptly opening them again, and blue light flashed within his pupils, allowing him to peer through the golden light. Immediately thereafter, his expression faltered slightly as he discovered that the piece of artwork was filled with countless golden flying swords of an identical style. These flying swords had been depicted in all sizes and positions, with the largest ones resembling gigantic heaven-splitting swords that struck him with the feeling that there were several hundred feet in length. In contrast, the smallest of these swords were only around an inch in length each, yet all of the patterns on the swords were extremely clear, as if they were right before his eyes. The presence of so many golden swords should have made the artwork extremely cluttered and chaotic, making one unable to discern one sword from another. But each and every flying sword on the piece of artwork was extremely lifelike, and they all possessed different auras that made them easily discernible from their counterparts. Han Li was quite elated to see this bizarre myriad sword artwork, and he stared intently at it as he remained still on the spot. However, only a brief moment had passed before Han Li suddenly gave a muffled groan and retreated a few steps as if he had been dealt a heavy blow by some kind of invisible power. He immediately twisted his own head away to remove his gaze from the artwork, not daring to inspect it any longer. At the same time, an unnatural flush appeared on his face. What powerful spiritual sense! It feels like I was actually being attacked by flying swords. If it weren't for the fact that I'm also proficient in using flying swords and possess a powerful spiritual sense of my own, my spiritual sense would have been severely damaged just now. Han Li's spiritual power rapidly circulated within his own meridians for a few cycles, following which his bodily condition returned to normal, but he still wore a stunned look on his face. However, after he calmed himself down, he immediately flipped a hand over to produce a stack of talismans of different colors. He then raised his hand, and the dozen or so talismans shot forth one after another, disappearing into the myriad sword artwork after just a few flashes. A peculiar scene then ensued. Rune projections of all types of different colors emerged from the surface of the artwork, enshrouding the golden light before rapidly shrinking. Under the pressure being exerted by these runes, the golden light emanating from the artwork began to reluctantly shrink as well before finally completely vanishing in the end. The rune projections then instantly reverted back into their talisman forms before plastering themselves firmly onto the piece of artwork. As a result, the auras being exuded by the sword artwork were instantly restricted, reducing it to an ordinary piece of artwork. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face upon seeing this, and he made a grabbing motion with one hand. The sword artwork was forcibly wrenched off the wall before landing in his grasp. Faint azure light flashed, and the artwork instantly rolled itself up into a scroll before vanishing in the blink of an eye. Only then did Han Li heave a faint sigh of relief. He didn't know if this myriad sword artwork had been created by the owner of this place, but even after taking only a brief glance at it, he could sense that this artwork was extremely profound and seemed to be imbued with some kind of mysterious cultivation method. It seemed to be a powerful sword art, but also like some kind of spiritual sense secret technique, but further inspection would be required before he could arrive at a definitive conclusion. After that, he strode over to the table, then swept a sleeve through the air to release a burst of azure light. The azure light instantly removed the lids of the jade boxes and small vials, but Han's brows immediately furrowed slightly as he swept his spiritual sense into those containers. There were several talismans in each of the 3 jade boxes, upon which were inscribed extremely complex beveled silver text runes. However, the spiritual chi within the talismans had also dissipated, rendering them completely useless. As for the 2 small vials, they were completely empty with only faint traces of spirit liquid left behind within them. It appeared that these 2 small vials had contained some kind of spirit liquid in the past, but the liquids had since dried up due to lackluster storage conditions. After a brief moment of contemplation, Han Li decided to stow away all of the talismans. These talismans were very different from the talismans on the golden jade tome that he possessed, so it would be a worthwhile endeavor for him to study and replicate the talismans. After that, he searched through the entirety of this secret chamber, but didn't make any further notable discoveries. Thus, he immediately exited this secret chamber before breaking into all of the remaining chambers one after another, but these ones were also completely empty. After he emerged from the final secret chamber, he immediately rushed back the same way he had come without any pause. Not long after that, Han Li appeared on the platform outside the gate of the side palace. He then glanced at the mountain paths leading to the other 2 side palaces and the main palace, and a contemplative look appeared on his face. At this point, Shikun and Liu Shuyer were most likely close to reaching the mountain summit. However, the illusionary formation on the plaza was extremely potent, and unless the 2 of them had some special tricks up their sleeves, they definitely wouldn't be able to pass through it in a short time. Even so, there wouldn't be too much time left for him, and he would only have a chance to search through one more place at most. With that in mind, Han Li's gaze began to wander back and forth between the 2 side palaces, and he was struggling to make a decision. All of a sudden, a thought occurred to him. One of the side palaces was surrounded by lush greenery and enshrouded under a burst of rich wood-attribute spiritual chi. Furthermore, the gentle breeze blowing over from that direction was intermingled with a faint medicinal aroma, and Han Li couldn't help but denounce himself for being an idiot. A medicine garden was a mandatory fixture for all cultivators' cave abodes. This place was left behind by an immortal, so there had to be a medicine garden here as well. Regardless of how valuable to other treasures here were, how could they compare to spirit medicines that could only be found in the true immortal realm? With his mysterious small vial, he could nurture any spirit medicine he found here at an extraordinary rate, so spirit medicines would be far more valuable to him than any other treasure that he could find here. From the spiritual chi wafting through the air in the distance, it was quite clear that the medicine garden lay in that direction. With that in mind, Han Li didn't hesitate any longer. He immediately rushed toward the area behind the main palace as a streak of azure light with his giant ape puppet in hot pursuit. With Han Li's insanely fearsome physical constitution, it only took him around 10 minutes to reach the cluster of buildings behind the main palace. He didn't know the exact location of the medicine garden, but it was very easy to identify where the wood attribute spiritual qi in the area was richest. He completely disregarded the other buildings that he passed by along the way, and arrived on a patch of flat ground between 3 pavilions after just a few flashes. There was a garden that was several acres in size here, and this was none other than the source of the faint medicinal aroma. However, the entire medicine garden was completely surrounded by 5 purplish-golden pillars and enshrouded under a 5-colored light barrier. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this. It was quite apparent that this was a large formation that would be far more troublesome to break through than the simple restrictions on the doors of the secret chambers from before. Following a brief moment of contemplation, he made a hand seal with one hand before opening his mouth to expel a ball of silver flames. A clear cry rang out from within the silver flames, and the silver fireball transformed into a small silver bird. It was none other than his spirit-engulfing fire raven. This fire raven was capable of devouring all types of spirit flames and spiritual powers, so it was naturally extremely proficient in breaking through restrictions like this one. Go, Han Li immediately instructed as he pointed at the 5-colored light barrier before him. The silver fire raven instantly spread its wings and shot forth as a ball of silver light at his behest. Boom! The 5-colored light barrier swayed slightly, immediately following which silver flames and 5-colored light intertwined with another amid a string of successive explosions. Flames danced around the silver fire raven's body, and those flames shot forth in all directions, devouring all of the 5-colored light that came into contact with it. Mere moments later, the light barrier had become noticeably thinner, and Han Li was ecstatic to see this. It appeared that this restriction that was left behind by an immortal was going to be far easier to break through than he'd anticipated. Just as he was about to spur on the fire raven to unleash more of its power, a low buzzing sound suddenly rang out from the 5 surrounding purplish-golden pillars. Immediately thereafter, brilliant 5-colored spiritual light erupted, and pillars of light surged forth before injecting themselves into the light barrier. Light instantly flashed from the thinning light barrier, and it immediately returned to its former density. Han Li's expression darkened upon seeing this. He immediately made a series of hand seals while chanting something before abruptly uttering the word expand, in a firm manner. A vicious light flashed through the spirit-engulfing fire raven's eyes, and it spread its wings before rising up into the air. It was originally only around a foot in size, but its body rapidly expanded, and it only took mere moments for it to swell to around 10 feet in size. The giant silver fire raven let loose a loud cry before flapping its huge wings downward in a violent manner. Countless silver feathers were sent flying through the air before transforming into fireballs that crashed down in a torrential barrage. A resounding boom immediately rang out across the heavens, and scorching flames completely inundated the entire light barrier down below. The 5 pillars were still constantly injecting spiritual power of the 5 elements into the light barrier, but that still couldn't prevent it from quaking violently. The massive silver bird withdrew its wings upon seeing this, before transforming into a massive fireball amid a flash of brilliant silver light, then came crashing down from above like a shooting star. An earth-shattering boom erupted, and the 5-colored light barrier was finally unable to hold itself together any longer, shattering into countless pieces. A hint of elation flashed through Han Li's eyes upon seeing this, and he was preparing himself to immediately rush into the medicine garden in the instant that the light barrier completely crumbled. However, his thought process proved to be too simple in the end. All of a sudden, the pillars of light erupting from the 5 purplish-golden pillars vanished, and in the next instant, a loud thunderclap rang out as arcs of purple lightning emerged. Han Li's expression immediately darkened significantly at the sight of this purple lightning. He glanced at the crumbling 5-colored light barrier and gritted his teeth, but instead of taking evasive measures, black qi surged forth from his body, and his suit of heavenly devilish armor appeared again. He injected his spiritual power into the suit of armor in a frenzy, and countless black runes shot forth from the surface of the armor, revolving around his body to form a protective barrier. Thunderclaps erupted as countless thin golden arcs of lightning sprang forth, forming a net of lightning that acted as an additional protective barrier around him. Immediately thereafter, he made a grabbing motion with one hand, and a stack of talismans instantly appeared before surging toward his body. Light flashed, and several layers of light barriers of different colors emerged outside of the lightning net. Right at this moment, Han Li swept a sleeve through the air to hurl forth his extreme essence-effused mountain. The mountain instantly swelled to over 100 feet in size at his behest before positioning itself in front of him like a giant shield. These arcs of purple lightning were indeed extremely fearsome, but surely they wouldn't be able to melt through this mountain. Almost in the exact same instant that Han Li completed all of these defensive measures, an enormous thunderclap erupted from each of the 5 purplish-golden pillars in unison. 5 bolts of purple lightning that were each as thick as large bowls surged forth before converging midway to form a massive ball of lightning that was around 5 feet in diameter. The ball of lightning then hurled directly toward Han Li with unstoppable force, and his expression darkened even further at the sight of its astonishing mass. However, he continued to remain still on the spot as he let loose a low cry before abruptly thrusting a palm toward the black mountain up ahead. The silver runes on the surface of the mountain immediately flashed, and a layer of gray light swept forth from the mountain directly toward the purple ball of lightning. The next instant, the two clashed, and a resounding boom rang out. The gray light barrier only managed to stall the lightning ball for a moment before being split apart. This didn't come as much of a surprise to Han Li. After all, the divine essence-effused light was quite profound, but it was only effective against 5 elemental power, so it naturally failed to have much of an effect on the secret lightning power from the true immortal realm. Thus, the purple ball of lightning continued onward and crashed directly into the black mountain. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face upon seeing this. His current extreme essence-effused mountain had more than just divine essence-effused light as its ability. Azure light suddenly flashed from his palm, which was pressed against the mountain face, and an incantation seal was injected into the mountain. A silver rune immediately drifted out of the mountain, before transforming into several fist-sized black holes that appeared in front of the mountain. The purple lightning ball crashed into these black holes in a flash, but passed through without any impediment. Han Li's expression stiffened slightly, but he could clearly see that in the instant that the lightning ball passed through the black holes, its diameter, which was originally around 5 feet, was reduced by over a third. However, before he had a chance to think about anything else, the lightning ball struck the black mountain amid an earth-shattering boom. Brilliant purple light erupted from the lightning ball, and 2 purple lightning snakes suddenly skirted around the giant mountain on either side, then hurtled directly toward Han Li as if they had minds of their own. The outermost layers of light barriers were instantly destroyed upon making contact with the purple lightning snakes, unable to offer any impediment. Han Li's eyelids twitched violently upon seeing this, but he suddenly waved a hand forward. The golden lightning net around his body instantly shot forth amid a rumbling thunderclap, hurtling directly toward the 2 bolts of purple lightning. Right at this moment, a crisp cracking sound rang out, and as soon as Han Li heard this sound, he immediately rushed off to the side, leaving a trail of afterimages in his wake. The 5-colored light barrier had finally been completely shattered by the silver fire raven's ferocious assault, but as the purple and golden lightning intertwined, the 2 bolts of purple lightning suddenly exploded. Purple light instantly completely inundated the golden light, and the enormous force of the explosion swept up a scorching tornado that was interspersed with countless traces of purple lightning. The tornado then swept up Han Li's body in a flash, and his expression abruptly changed as he was forced to stop on the spot. A resounding boom rang out as black runes abruptly exploded, transforming into bursts of black chi that intertwined with the purple lightning. Both powers exploded into nothingness. In the next instant, a golden projection with 3 heads and 6 arms emerged from within the black chi. The projection waved its arms through the air, and countless balls of golden light erupted from its 6 palms, forcing the tornado into a state of near collapse. A startling commotion rang out as black light suddenly flashed from the tips of the sharp spikes on Han Li's suit of devilish armor, following which pillars of black light that were as thick as human thumbs shot forth. The tornado was finally completely destroyed by these 2 types of attacks amid an anguished wail, and Han Li rushed toward the medicine garden again. However, right at this moment, a buzzing sound suddenly rang out from the 5 purple pillars, and light flashed violently as the shattered light barrier above the medicine garden instantly repaired itself. Han Li wanted to arrest his own momentum, but it was already too late, and he plunged headfirst into the 5-colored light. Loud thunderclaps rang out from all around him again, and lightning flashed from the surfaces of the 5 pillars. Bolts of purple lightning shot forth before transforming into purple lightning snakes that surged toward him amid a string of rumbling thunderclaps. Han Li's face immediately paled slightly upon seeing this. As his body was swept up by the 5-colored light, the surrounding space instantly became as hard as iron and steel. At the same time, a burst of enormous force came crashing down onto his body, completely immobilizing him. The 5 purple lightning snakes continued to hurtle toward him amid alarming thunderclaps, and Han Li was instantly plunged into life-threatening danger. However, he was certainly no ordinary being, and in the next instant the pale complexion of his face vanished. A frosty look then appeared in his eyes as he let loose a cold harumph, and golden light flashed from his body as the Provenant's true devil projection appeared again. However, on this occasion, it was vastly different from how it had been before. The projection itself was glowing with scintillating light, and it was as if a layer of golden paint had been applied to it, making it resemble a golden deity statue. This was none other than the golden body that Han Li had recently successfully cultivated. Right at this moment, Han Li opened his mouth, and a ball of black light was expelled from within. The ball of black light then vanished into the golden body in a flash as a burst of black chi. A hint of intelligence suddenly appeared in the wooden eyes of one of the projection's 3 heads, and a layer of black chi surfaced from its face. The massive golden body then positioned itself in front of Han Li in a flash, and at this point, the purple lightning arcs had already arrived. However, the golden body remained completely unfazed, as it swept 5 of its hands toward the arcs of purple lightning without any hesitation. Following a string of dull rumbling booms, 5 golden pillars of light shot forth from the projection's 5 palms to meet the arcs of lightning. The golden light and purple lightning instantly clashed not far away, and despite the immense power of the purple lightning, close to half of it was still eradicated by the pillars of light. However, the pillars of light had also vanished as a result of the clash. As such, Han Li should be able to escape this perilous situation if he were to control his golden body to unleash another wave of the same attacks. However, the remnants of the arcs of lightning didn't afford him this opportunity. Another string of loud thunderclaps rang out, and the purple lightning snakes abruptly appeared right in front of Han Li before crashing down in a vicious manner. However, in this dire situation, all of the arms of Han Li's golden body suddenly blurred, and they instantly vanished on the spot. In the next instant, the 5 arcs of purple lightning shuddered and were caught by 5 golden hands, which had appeared out of thin air without any warning. The fingers on the 5 hands closed in on one another, and the arcs of lightning were crushed into nothingness amid a few thunderclaps. Countless threads of lightning shot forth, and a small portion of them struck the golden body, but they merely vanished in a flash without being able to inflict any harm onto the golden body. However, thunderclaps were ringing out relentlessly from the 5 pillars in the distance, and 5 more arcs of lightning instantly appeared, looking as if they were going to hurtle toward Han Li again. Thankfully, this brief delay was enough for Han Li to formulate some countermeasures. With this powerful body and multitude of abilities, there was no way that this restriction would actually be enough to trap him. Thus, he immediately began to rapidly chant something, and black light swirled over his suit of devilish armor. His body then suddenly swelled drastically, and a layer of thick and coarse golden fur suddenly appeared over his skin. Blue light flashed from his eyes, and a pair of tusks protruded out of either side of his mouth. He had transformed into a giant ape that was over 100 feet tall. In his current form, he had blue eyes with golden fur, and a mouthful of sharp fangs that gave him a very menacing appearance. However, Han Li's usual calculated calmness could be seen within the ape's cold eyes, and his expression remained completely identical to the one that he wore in his original form. The heavenly devilish armor also expanded along with the giant ape, and spikes on its surface elongated to around a foot in length each. The spikes were flashing with frosty light and struck the beholder with a sense of horror. This was the giant mountain ape transformation of Han Li's 12 awakening transformations. As soon as he adopted this form, a burst of heat surged throughout his body in a frenzy from his dantian, rapidly flowing through all of his meridians. As a result, his body became around 40% to 50% more powerful. One had to realize that Han Li's physical body was already insanely powerful, and one could only imagine just how fearsome he currently was following this enhancement. In the next instant, the giant ape that he had transformed into immediately began to display its astonishing might. A low roar erupted from the giant ape's mouth, and abruptly flung its massive furry arms up into the air. The restrictive five-colored light barrier swayed violently in the face of the giant ape's enormous power, and Han Li was instantly able to struggle free. However, the five-colored light from slightly further away then immediately flashed before surging toward him, not giving him any respite. The giant ape immediately pointed a finger toward the silver fire raven up above without any hesitation, and at the same time, he pointed toward the black mountain off to the side with his other hand. The giant fire raven let loose a loud cry before transforming into a massive fireball that plummeted from the sky, crashing down directly toward the giant golden ape. Meanwhile, the black mountain suddenly whizzed through the air before disappearing into space. A resounding boom rang out as silver flames exploded near the giant ape, triggering waves of silver flames. The oncoming five-colored light was instantly forced away by the exploding flames, rendering them unable to approach the giant ape. At this point, the golden ape that was situated within the sea of flames had already flipped a hand over. Spatial fluctuations surged forth, and a black mountain that was over 100 feet tall appeared out of thin air before being easily hoisted up by a furry palm. The giant ape was making the mountain look as if it were a weightless toy. Immediately thereafter, Han Li did something that would give the onlooker a massive fright, had there been any onlookers present. A vicious light flashed through the eyes of the giant ape that he had transformed into, and he suddenly bent his mountain-carrying arm before drawing back, then abruptly hurling the extreme essence-effused mountain through the air like a rock. He hadn't used any abilities or techniques to spur the treasure into action. He was merely launching it through his own enormous physical strength. Letter 1D453, letter 1D633, letter 1D626, letter 1D452, letter 1D464, letter 1D452, letter 1D450, letter 1D45C, letter 1D45A. The extreme essence-effused mountain hadn't been enlarged to its maximal extent, so it wasn't in its absolute heaviest possible state, but it still weighed over 50,000 kilograms. After being hurled through the air, an extremely piercing screeching sound immediately rang out. The black mountain instantly transformed into a black shadow, leaving a trail of white gale-force winds in its wake. At the same time, a massive white mark also flashed through the mountain before abruptly appearing in midair. From a distance, it could be seen that the white mark was twisting and warping relentlessly, and there were bursts of powerful spatial fluctuations emanating from within it. It was as if a spatial rift were gradually taking shape, and that was sufficient testament to the tremendous force with which the giant ape had hurled the mountain. The mountain was hurtling directly toward one of the 5 purple pillars, and arcs of lightning instantly erupted from that pillar. Several purple arcs of lightning were released to attack the gargantuan oncoming projectile, but they were unable to slow down the black mountain, even in the slightest. In the next instant, the black mountain flew through the arcs of purple lightning before crashing viciously into the pillar. Purple and black light flashed, and an earth-shattering boom instantly rang out. A ball of piercing black, gray, and purple ball of 3-colored light instantly erupted from the pillar. The ball of light was like a scintillating 3-colored sun that forced the onlooker to avert their gaze. However, blue light flashed through the giant ape's eyes, allowing it to look directly at the ball of light and clearly glean what lay within it. The giant ape then immediately raised an arm, then made a grabbing motion with its huge furry hand toward the ball of light in the distance before quickly flipping its hand over. Spatial fluctuations erupted from above its palm, and an object appeared in a flash before landing on the giant ape's hand. It was none other than the black mountain that had just been hurled through the air. The surface of the mountain was still pitch black and completely unscathed, and just that alone was a clear indication of how extraordinarily hard it was. After recovering the black mountain, the giant ape immediately let loose a thunderous roar before swinging its arm forward and launching the mountain forward again. On this occasion, the mountain was sent flying toward another purple pillar. Thus, another responding explosion rang out as the mountain struck that second pillar. The same ball of scintillating light erupted forth, and at this point, the light radiating from the first pillar had already receded, thereby revealing its current state. The purple pillar was originally over 100 feet tall, yet it had now been reduced to less than half its original height, and there were purple shards that resembled both a stone and a metallic material strewn all over the nearby ground. The pillars had been forged through some mysterious unknown methods, but they definitely weren't as hard as an extraordinary treasure like the extreme essence-effused mountain. After all, this was a mountain that had been born from the energy of heaven and earth, and it was extremely resolute to begin with. Furthermore, it had been infused with that unknown grayish-white stone block, then underwent a second refinement using a refinement secret technique from the true immortal realm. Even if Han Li wanted to destroy it himself, he would have only been able to do so by using his spirit flame to melt it away bit by bit. On top of that, the mountain had been hurled using the devastating power of Han Li's giant mountain ape form, and if the pillars could still remain standing even in the face of such an attack, then Han Li would have immediately turned around and departed, as any further efforts expended to break the pillars would only be a waste of time and energy. Thus, Han Li hurled the extreme essence-effused mountain as a projectile on 5 successive occasions, destroying large sections of all of the 5 purple pillars. Without the support of the pillars, the 5-colored light barrier above the medicine garden was no match for the silver fire raven, and it was quickly completely devoured. The giant golden ape immediately made a hand seal upon seeing this, and golden light flashed from its body as it shrank down again while its fur receded. Han Li returned to his original form in the blink of an eye amid a flash of spiritual light, undoing his giant mountain ape transformation. He glanced at what remained of the pillars, and a hint of astonishment appeared in his eyes. He had only fused with the true spirit blood of the giant mountain ape just recently, and he didn't expect this transformation to imbue him with such enormous power. It seemed that this transformation suited him better than the other few types of transformations that he had mastered. After all, his other true spirit transformations only gave him a few extra abilities, or allowed him to sense and draw upon more of the world's origin chi, but none of them were able to dramatically enhance the power of his physical body like this giant mountain ape transformation could. If he had known from the beginning that this transformation would have been so effective, there would have been no need for him to waste time and take these risks. He could have just adopted this transformation from the get-go and destroyed the restriction through brute force. As expected of the true immortal realm, just the restriction placed over a mere medicine garden here was so difficult to bypass. After emerging from the plaza in front of the main palace, the restrictive power from the ground still existed, but it seemed to have abated significantly. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to hurl his extreme essence-effused mountain very far, even in his giant ape form. With that in mind, Han Li didn't hesitate any longer as he rushed directly toward the gate of the medicine garden. After the 5-colored light barrier was destroyed, everything within the medicine garden was revealed to him. The garden wasn't very large, but there was abundant wood attribute spiritual chi and the strong fragrance of spirit medicine surging toward him. As such, even though he hadn't yet made his way into the medicine garden, he knew that he had most likely made the right decision in coming here, and that he would definitely reap bountiful rewards. The entire medicine garden was surrounded by a low fence that was constructed from some kind of green vines. The gate of the garden consisted of 2 extremely simple boards that were only around 30 feet tall, and they were slightly ajar. Through the gaps in the fence, Han Li could roughly see what lay within the medicine garden from afar. The side of the medicine garden that was facing him was quite flat, and the spirit medicines planted there were all short ones that were less than half a foot tall. Han Li focused his gaze and ascertained what lay at the forefront patch of the medicine garden. The spirit medicines in this area of the medicine garden all had faint yellow leaves, but at their centers were thumb-sized fruits that were thin and pointy, bearing a resemblance to the red chili peppers of the human world. These fruits were emanating red light, and from a distance, they appeared to be miniature thumb-sized lamps that were quite endearing to behold. This entire section of the medicine garden was filled exclusively by this type of spirit medicine, so it was quite apparent that the owner of the garden held this medicine in very high regard. After ascertaining the appearances of these spirit medicines and their fruits, many thoughts quickly flashed through his mind. He had a feeling that he had read about this type of spirit medicine in the past, but he was unable to recall exactly what it was. Thus, he strode into the medicine garden with a contemplative look on his face. Just as he passed through the wooden gate, he was suddenly struck by a moment of enlightenment and finally recalled what this type of spirit medicine was. He had read about it in a very ancient tome back in the scattered star seas of the human world, and these spirit medicines were completely identical to the description in the records, so there was no mistaking it. He suddenly paused at the entrance to the medicine garden and cast his gaze toward this patch of spirit medicines, of which there were over 100. A peculiar look appeared on his face, and this seemed to be accompanied by a hint of a wry smile. So these are red silk fruits. Such aged red silk fruits would most likely be regarded as great treasures, even by immortals if they're avid alcoholics, Han Li murmured to himself. That's right, this peculiar spirit fruit was the main ingredient for brewing a certain type of extremely delectable spirit wine. Most of the cultivators in the scattered star seas would very likely be aware of red silk immortal wine to a certain extent. The rumors in the human world stated that this wine was something that only immortals would have the pleasure of tasting. Furthermore, it seemed that this wine was very vastly renowned, even in the immortal realm, and not just any immortal could drink it at will. There were many incredible legends about this type of wine, not just in the scattered star seas, but even in the human territories of the scattered star seas. However, regardless of the contents of these legends, the one overall consensus was that this wine was a rare delicacy even in the heavens among the gods. There were even some ignorant mortals who proclaimed that taking just a single sip of this spirit wine would bestow upon one enormous powers, and allow them to ascend straight to the true immortal realm. Han Li had seen relevant tomes regarding this wine, and he was naturally aware that something like that was impossible. The main reason behind this wine's scintillating reputation primarily lay in its rich and delectable flavor, and it was extremely difficult to find wine of its equal in all of the three realms. After taking a sip of this wine, its delectable flavor would remain in the drinker's mouth for over 10 days, and if one were to consume an entire flagon of this wine, they would fall completely into an inebriated state and sleep for 3 days and 3 nights, even if they were an immortal. Upon their awakening, they would become infatuated with this wine and constantly try to seek out more. Of course, regular consumption of this wine could slowly enhance one's physical constitution and also extend one's lifespan to a certain degree. As for the potency of these effects, that was something that was only known to the heavens. Most of these beneficial effects applied to low-grade cultivators or mortals, but despite this, even the avid wine consumers among immortals regarded this wine as a brilliant treasure. As such, it couldn't be said that these red silk fruits were completely useless, but for one such as Han Li, who rarely ever drank wine, these fruits were indeed rather redundant. Thankfully, there was another point mentioned in the tome that he had read. The richness and efficacy of red silk immortal wine were related, in large part, to the age of the red silk fruit that had been used to brew it. As such, red silk immortal wine was ranked in several grades depending on the age of the red silk fruit used, and red silk fruit was a plant that only flowered once every 1,000 years and bore fruit once every 10,000 years. The plant was also very difficult to nurture and was very prone to dying. Hence, it required dedicated care and attention day and night, and only after it bore fruit would it be able to survive without any supervision. As such, those who didn't enjoy drinking wine definitely wouldn't put in the effort to plant this type of spirit fruit. Even the immortals who valued wine on par with their lives would have to consider whether it was worth expending so much time and effort just to procure this fruit. This medicine garden had most likely existed since ancient times, and it seemed that no one had picked these red silk fruits ever since they had come into existence. Countless years had to have passed since their fruition, and one could only imagine the age and medicinal efficacy of these fruits. If he could use these fruits to brew red silk immortal wine, perhaps he would be blessed with some kind of unexpected miraculous effect. Even if they weren't particularly useful to him, he could sell the red silk immortal wine that he brewed using these fruits to those who enjoyed wine, and he would definitely be able to secure an astronomical sum for them. With that in mind, Han Li's expression finally eased slightly. Instead of immediately harvesting these spirit fruits, he continued on toward the nearby patches of the medicine garden, and there were 2 other types of spirit herbs that had also been planted en masse nearby. One of them resembled ordinary grass, but there were faint golden lines running through the green blades of grass. The spirit plant was emanating a rich, refreshing fragrance, and was as smooth and comfortable to the touch as warm jade. In contrast, the other type of spirit plant was completely different. These spirit plants were around half a foot tall with chaotic, crisscrossing branches and leaves. All of the plants were extremely colorful, and each of them bore several blackish-purple fruits. The surfaces of these fruits were filled with indentations, as well as spots of all colors, and they were truly hideous to behold. However, there were many of these spirit plants in this area of the medicine garden, which was why they had attracted Han Li's attention. Unfortunately, Han Li only managed to identify the latter type of these 2 spirit medicines, and he had no clue what that grass-like spirit medicine was. Even so, he was still currently ecstatic. This hideous spirit medicine was none other than the corrosive poison weed, which he had read about in a medicine tome back in Deep Heaven City. This type of spirit plant had already been extinct in the spirit realm for over 1 million years, and as the name suggested, it contained extremely potent poison. It was said that even a body integration being would be at serious risk of death if they were to consume parts of this plant. Coincidentally, the potent poison contained within the stems and fruits of these plants were mandatory ingredients for refining over 10 types of top-tier spirit medicines, including a few types of spirit pills that could directly facilitate breakthroughs for those at the body integration stage. And this was the main factor behind the corrosive poison weed's extinction in the spirit realm. Another factor behind this was the fact that it was impossible to transport and transfer this type of plant. No matter what kind of method was used, if this spirit plant were to be transferred and planted in an alternate environment, it would inevitably be reduced to a puddle of useless black water within a few years. As for nurturing new plants from seeds, no one had ever succeeded in doing this in the spirit realm. As such, this type of spirit plant was harvested into extinction after just a few tens of thousands of years following the discovery of its medicinal efficacy, and no one had discovered any of these plants ever since. Within this area of the medicine garden alone, there were around 70 to 80 of these spirit plants, and it was undoubtedly the case that all of them had been growing for countless years. If he were to use these spirits plants to refine his pills, their efficacy would definitely be significantly enhanced, so Han Li was naturally quite ecstatic to have discovered these plants here. Thus, he didn't hesitate any longer as he raised a hand into the air. A buzzing sound rang out as a black bracelet flew forth from his wrist before revolving in the air, then expelling a vast expanse of azure light in front of Han Li. He then made a hand seal before quickly pointing a finger into the air, and 30 to 40 identical jade boxes that were each around a foot in length emerged from within the azure light. The jade boxes were all flashing with spiritual light of different colors, and Han Li gently rustled his own sleeve again as he said, "Come on out, I have something for you to do." "Yes, master." A tender voice rang out from within his sleeve, immediately following which a ball of white light emerged from within. The ball of white light circled around in the air before suddenly transforming into a little girl who appeared to be around 6 to 7 years of age. The little girl wore a snowy white dress and had 9 little black braids woven into her hair. She was extremely adorable. This was none other than Quer, who was a manifestation of the soul of Han Li's ninth spirit ginseng. As soon as the little girl was summoned, she extended a respectful bow toward Han Li before appraising him with her large bright eyes, silently awaiting further instructions. "I've seen you harvest spirit medicines within the medicine garden on several occasions, and you're always able to do so extremely quickly. Harvest these 3 patches of spirit medicines for me and place them into those boxes," Han Li immediately instructed as he pointed at the 3 patches of spirit medicines. "That's a simple task. It'll only take me a few moments to complete," Quer replied as a smile appeared on her. She then rose up into the air and suddenly appeared above a patch of spirit plants in a flash. Immediately thereafter, she raised both of her little arms before gently flicking her 10 fingers downward. 10 green threads abruptly sprang forth before hurtling directly toward 10 of the spirit plants down below. These green threads burrowed into the stems of these spirit medicines in a flash, and Quer curled her fingers back slightly, upon which the 10 spirit plants that had been bound by the green threads were silently plucked out of the ground. Letter 1D4 1F, letter 1D5 6 3, letter 1D5 F2, letter 1D5 5 6, letter 1D5 6 8, letter 1D5 F2, letter 1D5 F0, letter 1D6 9 8, letter 1D4 6. Not only were the roots of the spirit plants very even and completely undamaged, there was also no soil clinging to them at all, as if they had already been washed. The green threads sprang forth once again, and the spirit medicines were immediately flung into one of the jade boxes with unerring accuracy. Quer then continued to flick her fingers through the air, and green threads shot forth relentlessly. The spirit plants in this area of the medicine garden were plucked out of the ground 10 at a time before rapidly falling into the jade boxes that had been prepared, and all of the plants that were in this area were uprooted in just the span of a few breaths. Quer's body then flashed again, and in the next instant she appeared in the air above another area of the medicine garden before harvesting the spirit plants there using the same method. Meanwhile, Han Li made his way over to a couple of nearby patches of spirit medicines, each of which consisted of batches of spirit plants that numbered between 5 or 6 to over 10, and he was only able to just barely identify a small portion of these plants. As for the remaining spirit medicines, which was more than half, there were no records about them in the tomes of the human world or the spirit realm. However, the small portion of plants that he had managed to identify were all extremely remarkable ones. Some of them were already extinct in the spirit realm, like the corrosive poison weed, while others still existed in the spirit realm, but were extremely rare and precious. As such, all he had to do was source some other spirit medicines that were a lot easier to find in comparison, and there was a good chance that he really would be able to fulfill the list of items that Qing Yuanzi had entrusted him with. Han Li forcibly repressed the excitement in his heart as he immediately leaned down to harvest these smaller batches of spirit medicines himself, then carefully categorized them before placing them into jade vials. After he finished collecting all of the spirit plants in these 2 patches, Quirrell was already standing obediently beside him. All of the 3 types of spirit medicines had already been completely harvested by her and neatly placed into jade boxes. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face, and he afforded her a benevolent compliment, in response to which a wide, elated smile also appeared on Quirrell's face. Even though it hadn't been a long time since she had attained this human form, she had been with Han Li for countless years in her rabbit form, so she wasn't unfamiliar with or distant from Han Li at all. Instead, she felt a sense of intimacy and closeness toward him. After harvesting all of the spirit medicines in this section of the medicine garden, Han Li finally cast his gaze toward the other side of the medicine garden. There were a dozen or so areas of different sizes that were separated into independent sections by wooden fences that were several feet tall. The spirit's plants in those areas included spirit trees that were several tens of feet tall, and spirit flowers that were several feet tall. There was also a spirit spring that was around 70 to 80 feet in size, and floating on the surface of that spring was a petite lotus seed pod that was flashing with silver light. Han Li took a deep breath before making his way over to that side of the medicine garden, before beginning to carefully appraise these spirit medicines one by one. However, a resigned look then appeared on his face mere moments later. He knew that the fact that these plants had been separated into individual sections clearly indicated that they were far more valuable than the red silk fruit and corrosive poisonweed from before. But regardless of whether it was the spirit trees that bore fist-sized green fruits or the peculiar spirit flowers that were of 10 different colors, he was unable to identify any of them. It appeared that these spirit medicines were unique to the true immortal realm and didn't exist in the spirit realm. As such, he would only be able to determine their uses through future experimentation. With that in mind, Han Li no longer hesitated and made a grabbing motion toward the ground in the distance with a single hand. A white jade box immediately rose up into the air before flying into his hand as a streak of white light. He then turned toward a spirit tree, which was laden with green fruits, and he flipped his other hand over to produce a small green shovel. He raised his hand, and the small shovel shot forth toward the ground in that area as a streak of green light, only to be repelled by the soil amid a crisp clang, unable to dig into the ground in the slightest. Han Li faltered slightly upon seeing this, and he was slightly incredulous as he activated his magic power again. The jade shovel immediately circled around before striking the ground again, and the same outcome eventuated as it was repelled once again. Han Li's eyelids twitched upon seeing this. He had solely been examining the spirit medicine itself earlier, and he had failed to inspect for any abnormalities in the soil down below. With that in mind, blue light immediately flashed through his eyes as he cast his gaze toward the soil down below, upon which a hint of surprise flashed over his face. He discovered that there were faint golden threads interlaced through the soil, and all of these threads had been constructed from extremely pure metal attribute spiritual qi. He didn't know if these spirit trees required this metal attribute spiritual qi to grow, or if the owner of this medicine garden was trying to protect these spirit plants, but the fact of the matter was that another restriction had been placed here. Han Li raised an eyebrow, and after a brief moment of contemplation, he suddenly let loose a cold chuckle. An inky black hand emerged from within his sleeve before sweeping downward, and a burst of gray light emerged from his palm, surging toward the ground before silently vanishing into the soil at the foot of the spirit tree. Divine essence-effused light was extremely potent against powers of all 5 elements, so it should be a simple matter for it to eradicate this metal attribute spiritual power. Or at least that was what Han Li thought. However, the scenes that unfolded next completely went against his expectations. The jade light swept downward, but the golden threads weren't easily eradicated as he thought that they would be. Instead, they abruptly intertwined to form a golden net that desperately resisted the oncoming gray light. Despite the ferocious assault being unleashed by the divine essence-effused light, it was unable to dispel this golden net in a short time. Han Li's expression changed slightly upon seeing this. Following a brief moment of contemplation, the fingers on his inky black hand moved slightly, and the projection of a small mountain appeared before encompassing his entire hand. The gray light at the center of his palm instantly congealed, and the gray light that was expelled thereafter became as viscous as liquid. He was trying to draw upon the power of his extreme essence-effused mountain to maximize the might of his divine essence-effused light. The golden threads were unable to resist such a fierce assault in the end, and vanished in the face of the powerful gray light. Han Li's heart eased slightly upon seeing this, and he waved his inky black hand through the air, upon which the small mountain projection instantly vanished. At the same time, the color of his hand also returned to normal. Immediately thereafter, he pointed a finger into the air again, and the small green shovel shot forth, plunging itself into the ground before digging in a circle around the base of the spirit tree, then flying back into Han Li's sleeve. A vast expanse of azure light then immediately appeared in the places that the jade shovel had dug through, and this azure light enshrouded the entire spirit tree within. Han Li immediately made a hand seal and cast an incantation seal toward the spirit tree upon seeing this. The incantation seal vanished into the spirit tree in a flash, and the entire tree shuddered slightly before being uprooted from the ground in a slow and steady manner. Letter 1D4 BB, letter 1D4 5F, letter 212F, letter 212F, letter 1D4 64, letter 1D4 52, letter 1D4 4F, letter 1D4 B8, letter 1D4 5C, letter 1D6 2E. A hint of elation flashed through Han Li's eyes. However, in the instant that the roots of the spirit tree left the soil, a layer of unsettling green flames suddenly appeared over its surface without any warning. The green flames only flickered a few times, and the spirit tree, as well as all of its fruits, were incinerated into nothingness. Han Li's mouth gaped open in exasperation upon seeing this. He only heaved a long sigh after a long while, and he appraised the empty patch of ground where the spirit tree had once been with a gloomy look on his face. However, there was no use crying over spilled milk. Han Li immediately turned before striding toward another fenced-off area, which contained a strange flower that was around 3 feet tall and as pristine white as jade. The soil around this flower didn't have any restrictions, and the jade shovel was able to plunge into the ground without any impediment. However, in the instant that this flower was uprooted, it abruptly shuddered before melting into a puddle of green liquid that seeped into the soil and vanished from sight. Han Li could only lament his ill fortune after encountering such delicate spirit medicines twice in succession. He took one final indignant glance at the spot where the puddle of green liquid had seeped into the soil, and he grumbled something unintelligible to himself before progressing onto the next area in a resigned manner. For the next 3 spirit medicines he attempted to harvest, all of them displayed different reactions in the instant that their roots left the ground. One of them suddenly wilted away into dust, one of them suddenly self-detonated, and a net of lightning appeared over the surface of the final plant, which zapped itself into nothingness. 5 consecutive spirit medicines had destroyed themselves on the spot, and it didn't take a genius to figure out that something was amiss. This inability to be transferred definitely wasn't an innate quality that all of these spirit medicines shared. This was most likely a result of some restrictions the owner of this medicine garden had set up. Otherwise, how could 5 of these plants have destroyed themselves one after another? Thus, as Han Li approached a fist-sized spirit flower that was split up into 13 different vibrant colors, he didn't immediately try to harvest it. Instead, he began to inspect the spirit medicine in a meticulous manner. His spiritual sense hadn't detected anything amiss earlier, so he naturally had to rely on his bright-sight spirit eyes to see if he could sense anything. Thus, extremely piercing blue light flashed through his eyes as he inspected every single inch of the flower from petal to stem. However, even after inspecting the entire flower 7 or 8 times, he was still unable to glean anything of use. Thus, he was left feeling rather perplexed. He couldn't even see what kind of restriction the owner of the medicine garden had set up, so there naturally wasn't going to be any way for him to remove the restriction. However, he naturally couldn't bear to just leave behind these spirit medicines, many of which couldn't even be found in the spirit realm. He crossed his arms and stood on the spot with a contemplative look on his face, and after around 10 minutes, he heaved a faint sigh before murmuring to himself, The plants self-destruct as soon as their roots leave the soul. The restrictions have most likely been set up on their roots. In that case, I won't be able to take the entire plant, but I should be able to forcibly preserve the fruits and seeds. With that in mind, he immediately cast his gaze toward the vibrant flower again. He then tossed one of his jade boxes forward and controlled it so that it hovered in a stable manner directly below the flower. Immediately thereafter, he quickly rustled a sleeve, and a pristine white hand emerged from within. Azure light flashed, and a sharp sword thread shot forth in a flash, brushing directly past the stem of the flower. At the same time, a burst of 5 colored flames also hurtled forth. The strange flower had only just had its stem severed when the 5 colored flames engulfed it, and it was instantly sealed as a block of translucent 5 colored ice. Following a faint clack, the block of ice fell into the jade box down below with unerring accuracy. He raised his hand again, and several talismans shot forth before adhering themselves to the jade box in a flash. Vibrant restrictive power instantly enveloped the entire box, and he swept his sleeve through the air once again to expel a burst of azure light. The jade box instantly disappeared within the azure light, having been stowed away by Han Li. From the instant that the sword thread was unleashed to the moment that the jade box was stowed away, only an instant had passed, and only after securing the spirit flower did Han Li heave a faint sigh of relief as his expression eased slightly. He looked at the severed stem of the flower and hesitated momentarily, but decided not to do anything to it as he moved on to the next area. The next 7 or 8 spirit medicines were all secured using the method. Han Li first severed the fruits or other important parts of the plants that contained their seeds, then quickly froze them before sealing them with restrictive talismans. After adopting this method, he was finally able to prevent the plants from self-destruction. Even if those parts also had some restrictions set up within them, as long as he could prevent those restrictions from being set off for now, he could take them back for further examination in the future. He was confident that, as long as he had sufficient time, he would be able to slowly undo those restrictions. However, he still encountered a lot of trouble when he reached the last type of spirit medicine, which was the silver lotus seed pod that was floating at the center of the spring. As the sword thread struck the stem of the seed pod, which was around as thick as a finger, a ball of dazzling silver light suddenly erupted, and the sword thread was repelled while the lotus seed pod remained completely unmoved. Han Li couldn't help but falter upon seeing this. He carefully inspected the shimmering silver seed pod multiple times with furrowed brows, before flicking his 10 fingers toward it in quick succession. 10 azure threads shot forth through the air before suddenly converging as one, forming a translucent streak of azure light that struck the stem of the seed pod, only for the same thing to happen again. Dazzling silver light was released by the entire seed pod, and the azure light was completely destroyed into nothingness. Han Li's eyelids twitched violently upon seeing this. Just what kind of extraordinary spirit item was this silver lotus seed pod? The sword threads formed by his azure bamboo cloudswarm sword were so sharp that even the average body integration stage being wouldn't dare to allow them to strike their body. Yet not only was this spirit plant able to repel the sword threads, it was even able to retaliate and destroy them. This was simply incredible. Han Li's gaze quickly roamed over the entire seed pod, before quickly moving on to the spring that the lotus seed pod was floating upon. This spring clearly wasn't any normal spirit spring. Not only was the water in it extremely clear and pure, there were also faint wisps of white spiritual chi that were constantly floating up from it. At the bottom of the spring, there were several lotus roots that were about the same length as a child's arm. The lotus roots were also of a shimmering silver color, and they appeared to be completely spotless and pristine. Han Li focused his gaze on the lotus roots to find that its finer whiskers were as pristine white as jade, and they didn't burrow into the mud down below. Instead, they were curled up into a ball and floating beside the seed pod like a ball of silver mist. This discovery was quite a reassuring one to Han Li, and his expression changed slightly as he fell into contemplation again. However, he didn't think for too long this time before deciding to make another attempt. He flipped a hand over, and a blue jade vial that was around a foot tall appeared over his palm. He tossed the vial toward the center of the spring, and it hovered in a stable manner in midair. He then swept a sleeve through the air, and a dozen or so formation flags of different colors shot forth before vanishing into the area surrounding the center of the spring in a flash. After that, he made a hand seal before uttering the word seal. A dozen or so pillars of light of different colors erupted into the air, and each of them reached several tens of feet in height. Each pillar was shimmering with spiritual light, and there were faint runes constantly hovering around them. This was clearly no ordinary formation. And Li raised both of his hands without any hesitation upon seeing this, then flicked one incantation seal through the air after another. Countless specks of blue light suddenly appeared within the air in a radius of several tens of feet, and a burst of rich, water-attribute spiritual chi instantly filled the entire formation. The spirit spring down below seemed to have also sensed something, and a layer of ripples surged along the surface of the spring, as if in resonance. The ripples were very faint, yet it was definitely a marked difference compared to the still mirror-like surface of the water. Cold light flashed through Han Li's eyes, and he let loose a low cry before pointing a finger toward the jade vial that was hovering in midair. The jade vial instantly tipped itself upside down before expelling a burst of blue light. All of the surrounding pillars of light then emitted a buzzing sound in unison, and restriction fluctuations immediately erupted forth. In the next instant, all of the specks of light in the air surged toward the blue light to bolster it, and the blue light inundated the entire spring in the blink of an eye. An earth-shattering boom erupted, and the entire spring trembled as the water within abruptly became a lot more turbulent. The spring water swept forth in a frenzy and began to revolve around the silver lotus seed pod, instantly forming a vortex that had a diameter of around 10 feet. The turbulent waves instantly swept up the silver lotus seed pod, and Han Li began to flick incantation seals through the air with greater urgency upon seeing this. At the same time, he began to chant something, and the lotus seed pod was immediately enveloped by the revolving spring water, which then transformed into a water dragon amid the bursts of blue light. Immediately thereafter, this water dragon began to shrink and was sucked into the blue jade vial in its entirety in the end. Han Li's heart thumped violently as he waited in an apprehensive manner, but thankfully no mishaps occurred, and the silver lotus seed pod and the lotus roots were completely undamaged after it was drawn into the jade vial. The steady stream of incantation seals being released by his hand ceased, and he waved a hand toward the jade vial. The blue vial immediately flew toward him as a ball of blue light before landing in his hand, upon which he immediately released his spiritual sense to inspect the contents of the vial. As a result, he discovered that the silver lotus seed pod and the lotus roots were all completely unharmed as they floated within the spring water, and this naturally made him quite ecstatic. After sealing the jade vial with a bunch of talismans, Han Li stowed it away into his storage bracelet in an extremely careful manner, placing it among the large pile of jade boxes. This was the only complete spirit plant that he had been able to obtain from this area, and securing it alleviated some of his frustration of destroying the first 5 spirit medicines. After that, Han Li explored the entire medicine garden, and regardless of whether he recognized the spirit medicines he encountered, he collected all of them without a second thought. Perhaps these spirit medicines were considered to be very ordinary items in the eyes of the owner of this place, but they were naturally extremely precious in the spirit realm, and he had reaped vastly bountiful rewards during this trip to the medicine garden. After ascertaining that he hadn't missed any spirit medicines, Han Li decided to immediately depart from this place. Thus, he issued an instruction to Quer, and she disappeared up his sleeve as a ball of white light before he strode out of the medicine garden. In the instant that he emerged from the garden, a dull rumbling boom suddenly rang out from the direction of the main palace up ahead. Immediately thereafter, a burst of powerful spiritual pressure fluctuations erupted into the air from the same direction, creating quite an alarming spectacle to behold. Han Li's heart immediately stirred upon hearing this, following which a hint of a smile appeared on his face. It appeared that Shikun and Liu Shuyer had finally been driven to the ends of their wits by the illusionary formation on the plaza, and broke through it using brute force. Judging from the spiritual pressure fluctuations, it seemed that the illusionary formation really had been forcibly broken, which indicated that the two of them had to have used some kind of secret technique or treasure that far exceeded the boundaries of what they were currently able to wield. Otherwise, with the powers that the two of them had displayed thus far, there was no way that they would have been able to accomplish this. With that in mind, Han Li glanced at the 2 remaining side palaces and contemplated his options briefly before deciding to make his way toward the main palace. Moments later, he appeared in front of the main palace again, just in time to see purple light flashing from the gate of the main palace. Meanwhile, Shikun was forced to stumble backward a dozen or so steps as he let loose a muffled groan. The giant hammers that he was holding were quickly melted away by the flashing purple lightning, leaving only a pair of handles in his hand in the blink of an eye. His face was completely devoid of color, and there was a hint of astonishment in his eyes. However, before he could unleash any other abilities to ward off the purple lightning snakes, Liu Xiuye, who was standing over 100 feet behind him, sprang into action. She hurled a silver mirror through the air, and the surface of the mirror tremored before several azure pillars of light shot forth to temporarily keep the purple lightning snakes at bay. Shikun immediately took advantage of this opportunity to let loose a low roar as he rushed back in retreat, instantly hurtling back around 300 feet. At this moment, the azure pillars of light were unable to withstand the power of the purple lightning and were shattered amid a loud thunderclap. The purple lighting snakes then trailed along the direction of the pillars of light and switched to Liu Xiuye as their target. Liu Xiuye's heart jolted upon seeing this, but she acted in a very decisive manner, abruptly pointing a finger up at the mirror treasure in the air, upon which the mirror flew directly toward the lightning snakes at her behest. Immediately thereafter, her body swayed, and she abruptly vanished as a trail of afterimages. In the next instant, she also appeared extremely far away from the palace gate. A dull explosion rang out as the purple lightning struck the silver mirror, and following a string of rumbling thunderclaps, the mirror exploded as a ball of silver light. After losing the nearby targets, the purple lightning snakes flashed erratically a few times before also dissipating of their own accord. Liu Xiuye had already expected that her mirror would be destroyed by the purple lightning, but her expression had naturally darkened significantly, nonetheless. Right at this moment, Han Li slowly strode over to them and said, "Fellow Taoists, this restriction is not your average restriction. If we want to break it, then we'll most likely have to work together." Shikun and Liu Xiuye were naturally made aware of Han Li's arrival upon hearing this. Shikun's face twitched slightly, and there was a sour look in his eyes as he grumbled, "You sure are a cunning man, Brother Han. You knew that this restriction would be difficult to break, so you went elsewhere. You arrived here far earlier than the two of us, so you must have reaped bountiful rewards already, right?" "I did indeed reap some rewards, but how can they compare with the treasures in the main palace? I'm sure the two of you are aware that the treasures requested by our two seniors and all of the other important treasures must be in there," Han Li replied with a nonchalant smile. "This place was once inhabited by an immortal, and mediocre treasures in their eyes will most likely all be extremely useful to us. However, we decided on this arrangement in the beginning, so I certainly can't complain, seeing as Brother Han has secured a head start through his own power. Besides, there definitely wasn't enough time for Brother Han to explore this entire place, so there are surely more rewards left to be reaped. Fellow Taoist, she and I are not without chances." Liu Xiuye chuckled in response, and she seemed to be truly unbothered by the fact that Han Li had secured a head start. Shikun's expression suddenly changed slightly upon hearing this, and he smiled as he said, "However, Brother Han is clearly the most powerful among us, so we hope that you can put in some extra effort when we attempt to break the restriction on this main palace." "I'm the most powerful one among us. I certainly wouldn't dare to agree to that sentiment, but rest assured, I'll be sure to put in my best effort," Han Li replied as he nodded in an expressionless manner. Liu Xiuye and Shikun exchanged a glance upon hearing this, and both of them were feeling rather reassured after securing Han Li's promise. Both of them were very proud individuals, but after scaling that mountain path and forcibly breaking that illusionary formation, they had expended a significant portion of their magic power. Without the assistance of an unfathomable being such as Han Li, it really would be quite difficult for them to break the restriction on this main palace. They didn't have to worry about Han Li suddenly turning on them after they broke this restriction, as Kai Living and Duan Tianren were still waiting for them back at Cloud City, and those two body integration stage seniors were going to act as their safety nets. With the vast array of powerful abilities that Han Li had displayed during this trip, the two of them were no longer just envious. They had become quite wary of and defensive toward him. But then again, if it weren't for Han Li's unfathomable power, they would perhaps be inclined to revoke their original agreement of splitting the treasures aside from the ones requested by Kai Ling and Duan Tianren. Liu Xiuye and Shikun were both wary of Han Li's abilities, and they knew that they may not be a match for him even in a 2-on-1 battle, so they naturally weren't going to turn on him. In contrast, Han Li was confident in his ability to kill these two, but he didn't want to break their pact as that could potentially affect his mental state, thereby manifesting inner demons. Furthermore, he was also quite wary of Kai Ling and Duan Tianren as well, so he didn't harbor any ulterior motives. As such, the three of them were just barely able to maintain a stable balance. However, taking into consideration the fact that there were Jiao Kai beings nearby, it was naturally best to secure the treasures as soon as possible. This was why Liu Shuye and Shi Kun had immediately attempted to break into the main palace after emerging from the illusionary formation, despite the fact that they knew the restriction on the palace gate would most likely be quite formidable. In the end, they discovered that the restriction was even more powerful than they'd expected, and it had destroyed Shi Kun's hammers and Liu Shuye's mirror in virtually the blink of an eye. Those two treasures weren't the most powerful ones in their repertoires, but they were definitely the treasures that they used the most and were most comfortable with using. As such, they were naturally both feeling quite dejected that the treasures had been destroyed for nothing. Thus, as soon as Han Li appeared, they decided to try and make him carry the brunt of the load when it came to breaking this restriction. I wouldn't mind expending some more effort to break this formation, but I'm sure that Senior Kai and Senior Duan must have prepared many treasures for the two of you to address the potential restrictions that you may encounter. It would be best to break this restriction in one go in order to conserve time and magic power, so if the two of you have any special treasures, then I'd advise you to bring them out now, Han Li said in a serious manner. Shi Kun and Liu Shuye both faltered momentarily upon hearing this. Of course, Brother Han, seeing as you've conveyed your point so clearly, I certainly won't be holding back either. I have a set of treasures that are quite effective when it comes to breaking restrictions, and I'll be sure to assist you with all my power, Liu Shuye assured with a smile. After a brief hesitation, Shi Kun also chimed in. I have no objections either. The sooner we secure these treasures, the sooner we'll be able to go our separate ways. I'm still hoping to find a good place to go into seclusion so I can break through my bottleneck. As such, I'll also be using a restriction-breaking talisman that my master has bestowed upon me. A content look appeared on Han Li's face after hearing this, and he didn't say anything further as he strode toward the palace gate. Liu Shuye and Shi Kun followed along behind him, one on his left and the other on his right. Letter 1D453, letter 1D45F, letter 1D452, letter 1D626, letter 1D4CC, letter 1D452, letter 1D4B8, letter 1D630, letter 1D45A. In the end, all three of them stopped over 100 feet away from the gate. Han Li cast his gaze toward the gate before taking a deep breath. Following his experience in breaking the formation in the medicine garden, he had developed a certain level of confidence toward addressing the purple lightning here. In the face of the powerful purple lightning, it was quite clear that the first person to attack the gate would be the one to bear the brunt of the restriction's retaliative force. As long as he could withstand this retaliation, it would become a lot easier for the three of them to break the restriction. With that in mind, Black Chi began to emerge from his body, and his suit of heavenly devilish armor resurfaced. Layers of black runes appeared around the suit of armor, instantly concealing most of his body. He then let loose a long cry, and brilliant golden light radiated around him as a golden projection with 3 heads and 6 arms emerged behind him. Han Li made a hand seal, and golden light began to swirl around the projection's body. At the same time, the surface of the projection became extremely bright, as if a coat of golden paint had suddenly been applied to it. That's a golden body. Liu Shuye was quite knowledgeable, and she immediately identified the nature of the projection as a stunned look appeared on her face. Shi Kun's expression also changed to mirror hers upon hearing her stunned words. Many high-grade cultivation arts could manifest projections when cultivated to a certain degree, but it was extremely rare for a projection to be cultivated into a golden body. Not only was this due to the fact that relevant cultivation arts were extremely rare, the materials required to manifest golden bodies were always extremely rare and difficult to gather. If it weren't for the fact that Han Li had been extremely fortunate and secured several of the main ingredients in quick succession, he wouldn't have been able to achieve this. As such, Liu Shuye and Shi Kun were both quite astonished, and they looked on with bated breath as they waited for Han Li to take the lead. Immediately thereafter, Han Li flipped a hand over, and a miniature black mountain appeared over his palm before it was hurled through the air. Gray light flashed from the mountain, and it abruptly swelled to over 100 feet in size before crashing viciously toward the palace gate. A loud rumbling boom rang out, and as soon as the mountain struck the gate, countless arcs of purple lightning erupted forth before intertwining to form a lightning net. Even with the extreme essence-effused mountain's extraordinary weight, it was stopped cold in its tracks by the lightning net and unable to advance any further. Almost at the exact same time, a resounding thunderclap rang out, and several lightning snakes erupted from the gate before hurtling toward Han Li in a flash. Han Li's expression remained completely unchanged upon seeing this, and he only narrowed his eyes slightly as golden light flashed before him. His golden body abruptly appeared in front of him, and its 6 arms blurred as it waved its shimmering golden hands through the air at once to oppose the purple lightning snakes. Golden and purple light flashed, and the golden hands remained completely unscathed. They then grabbed onto the purple lightning snakes in unison, only for more purple arcs of lightning to erupt from the door in the next instant. However, those arcs of lightning were also caught by the golden body, and Liu Xiu'er and Shi Kun were both stunned and ecstatic to see this. The two of them glanced at one another before taking this opportunity to strike without any hesitation. Shi Kun opened his mouth to expel a shimmering silver talisman, which transformed into a silver ball of light that shot forth toward the palace gate in a flash. Meanwhile, Liu Xiu'er swept a sleeve through the air, and 3 shimmering golden short halberds instantly shot forth at once before also hurtling toward the gate amid a peculiar shrieking sound. The silver ball of light and 3 streaks of golden light struck the purple lightning on the palace gate almost at the exact same time, and spiritual light flashed as the silver talisman vanished without a trace into the lightning. In contrast, the 3 streaks of golden light struck the palace gate amid a resounding boom, and the 3 golden halberds were revealed to have pinned themselves tightly to the purple lightning net in a triangular formation. The rumbling thunderclaps from the lightning net instantly receded, and most of its power was absorbed by the 3 golden halberds, thereby significantly diminishing its effect. At this moment, Shi Kun began to chant something before pointing a finger at the gate with a serious look on his face. A muffled thump rang out, and white light flashed before a pristine light lotus that was as white as snow suddenly blossomed on the palace gate. Initially, it was only around the size of a human fist, but in the next instant, it swelled to as large as a human head. The purple arcs of lightning from the palace gate were still flashing violently, but they couldn't do anything to the illusionary spirit flower and were powerless to halt its growth. In the end, close to half of the entire palace gate was enshrouded within the white lotus projection. Explode! A vicious look appeared on Shi Kun's face as he cast one final incantation seal, and the light lotus projection immediately shuddered before exploding amid an earth-shattering boom at his behest. A scorching white ball of light that resembled a scintillating sun appeared on the palace gate, and the white light instantly inundated the entire gate, along with the purple lightning net in an extremely emphatic manner. When the white light finally dissipated, the palace gate reappeared, and it was revealed that there were now countless craters indentations on its surface. The gate was in an extremely sorry state, but it hadn't been completely destroyed, and as purple light flashed over its surface, it quickly began to repair itself at a rate that was discernible to the naked eye. However, all of the purple arcs of lightning had been wiped out, and the extreme essence-effused mountain was free again as a result. Han Li immediately took advantage of this, and the extreme essence-effused mountain abruptly circled around at his behest before releasing a burst of bright grayish-white light, then swelled drastically to around twice its original size before crashing toward the palace gate once again. On this occasion, there was nothing to impede it, and the black mountain struck the palace gate amid a deafening boom. As the power of the restriction had been severely debilitated, the palace gate was finally shattered by the enormous force behind the extreme essence-effused mountain. Thus, the Black Mountain flew directly into the main palace, and Han Li was naturally ecstatic to see this. He swept a sleeve through the air, and the projection golden body before him abruptly vanished as if it had never even been there in the first place. Both Liu Xiu'er and Shi Kun then rushed forward from behind him in a bid to enter the palace first, and both of them simultaneously appeared at the entrance to the palace in a wraith-like manner after just a few flashes. Immediately thereafter, they paused on the spot before looking on ahead with peculiar looks on their faces. "Brother Shi, my master's instructions to me were very clear. I have to secure the spirit void pill within the main palace. As for everything else, you can choose the treasures that Senior Duan stipulated from among them," Liu Xiu'er said after a brief pause. "But I've also received instructions from my master to secure the spirit void pills no matter what. How about this? I can offer everything else to you aside from the spirit void pills. Of course, my master will offer alternative reciprocation to Senior Kai in exchange." Shikun chuckled in response, but his voice had clearly taken on a more stoic tone. What do you mean by that, fellow Taoist Shi? Haven't you repeated what I just said? My master made it very clear to me that I must secure the spirit void pills, and that she would accept no alternatives. If you're willing to back down, then I can promise you a vial of our crystal race's revered crystal moon liquid in my master's stead. I'm sure you know what this spirit liquid entails for stone cocoon being like you, brother Shi. This is an extremely sought-after item for even the holy grade beings of your stone cocoon race. A cold look had appeared in Liu Shuyer's eyes, but her tone had become more gentle and benevolent. Crystal moon liquid. Shikun's expression changed slightly upon hearing this, and it was quite clear that this was a completely unexpected offer that was truly quite tempting to him. However, he then immediately thought back to Duan Tianren's stern instructions prior to his departure, and his heart instantly jolted as he cast aside his personal desires. He immediately shook his head and refused, no. Crystal moon liquid is indeed very tempting to me, but without the spirit void pills, I won't be able to answer to my master, so this is a non-negotiable matter. So you're not willing to back down or compromise at all, fellow Taoist Shi. Liu Shuyer's voice had also taken on a cold and forbidding tone. On this occasion, Shikun didn't offer a reply. He merely appraised Liu Shuyer with a cold expression, and his intentions were as plain as day. Liu Shuyer also fell silent, and met his cold gaze with a frosty one of her own. All of a sudden, the atmosphere became extremely tense, and Han Li couldn't help but furrow his brows slightly upon seeing this. This is not the time to be quarreling, fellow Taoists. I don't know what extraordinary effect these spirit void pills possess to make them so desirable to our two seniors, but don't you think it's too early to be engaging in conflict when we haven't even ascertained whether these pills are truly in this palace? Shikun's expression stirred slightly upon hearing Han Li's words, and Liu Shuyer also turned toward him as a peculiar look flashed through her eyes. Our two seniors may be convinced that there are spirit void pills in this palace, but I would assume that this verdict was reached based on circumstantial evidence. After all, they haven't gained access to this place in the past, so it's yet to be seen whether their deductions are indeed correct. Why don't we enter the palace and ascertain whether these pills can truly be found here before the two of you make a decision? Han Li suggested in a calm manner. Contemplative expressions appeared on both Shikun and Liu Shuyer's faces upon hearing this proposal. Two of them had naturally already considered the possibility that Han Li had just raised, but in the instant that the palace gate was broken, the two of them were so eager to get a head start over the other that they had forgotten about their prior suspicions. Now that Han Li had reminded them of this possibility, both of them returned to their senses, and it naturally became quite clear to them that their top priority was to find the spirit pills first before deciding who would claim them. You're right, Brother Han. Fellow Taoist Shi, let's determine whether there actually are spirit void pills in this palace before we discuss anything else, Liu Shuyer said in a slow voice. I have no objections to this proposal, Fairy Liu. He knew that Han Li's presence could play a major role in which side claimed the spirit void pills in the end, so he squeezed a smile onto his face and agreed to compromise for now. Seeing as the two of you have reached a temporary resolution, why don't we all head inside together? Han Li said with a smile before taking a few steps and reaching the two of them. Shikun and Liu Shuyer naturally didn't have any basis to refuse, and they both nodded in response. Thus, the three of them entered the palace one after another, then arranged themselves side by side before appraising the entire palace. As expected of the main palace, the interior was close to 10,000 feet in size, and it could comfortably house several thousand people. The first things that everyone saw were the purple pillars inside the palace, each of which was as thick as a human, and there were over 100 such pillars. There were also many antiquated weapons that were hanging from the walls of the palace, all of which were either long halberds or giant axes, and they were all shimmering with silver light while emitting powerful spiritual qi. At a rough glance, there appeared to be close to 1,000 such weapons, and placed at regular intervals at the foot of the walls were suits of colorful armor. The suits of armor were completely empty, and it was quite clear from the intricate patterns carved on their surfaces that these weren't ordinary suits of armor. On the other end of the palace that was directly facing the gate was a massive screen that was shimmering with azure light. There seemed to be something drawn onto the screen, but it was difficult to make out exactly what was drawn on it as it was too far away. There was a short table that resembled a tea table in front of the screen, upon which was sitting a golden cauldron. Aside from that, the entire palace was completely empty without any embellishments, so there was no need for them to make any extra effort in searching for treasures. Han Li's trio was naturally quite surprised to see this, and Han Li cast his gaze toward the screen and golden cauldron in the distance. Following a brief moment of contemplation, he strode directly toward that direction, and Liu Shuyer and Shi Kun exchanged a quick glance before immediately averting their eyes, then followed along behind Han Li. After all, there wasn't really anything that didn't appear to be worth investigating in the entire palace, aside from the screen and the golden cauldron. Thus, 3 of them made their way to over 100 feet away from the screen, and the golden cauldron under a strange atmosphere. Han Li stopped on the spot and began to appraise the 2 items from afar. Shi Kun and Liu Shuyer also reflexively stopped and began to inspect the 2 items with differing expressions. Han Li had his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression appeared to be quite calm and placid, but there was already blue light flashing deep within his eyes. The surface of the screen was concealed by a layer of azure light, but that certainly wasn't going to stump his spirit eye ability. Thus, he was instantly able to glean what had been drawn on the screen, and a hint of surprise appeared on his face. The artwork on the screen depicted a strange, massive gate that had golden and silver runes inscribed on its surface. The gate was antiquated in design and completely black in color, but the 2 types of runes on its surface were constantly flashing, giving it an intriguing air of mystery. The golden and silver runes bore a slight resemblance, and they were none other than beveled silver text and golden seal text, both of which were spirit texts used in the true immortal realm. Han Li raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, and he instantly released a wisp of spiritual sense toward the giant gate on the screen. As soon as his spiritual sense came into contact with the giant gate artwork, a burst of enormous force erupted from the screen, and before that wisp of spiritual sense had a chance to react, it was dragged into the screen, thereby completely cutting off its connection with Han Li. Han Li's expression changed slightly, and he instantly developed a sense of caution toward this screen. Shi Kun let loose a muffled groan and stumbled back a half step before immediately catching himself. He had clearly also fallen victim to this screen's power, and it appeared that he had been affected more so than Han Li. Liu Shuyer's face was concealed by her hood, so it was impossible to glean her expression, but her body also swayed slightly before she managed to steady herself, so she had also definitely been made aware of the peculiar nature of this screen. Han Li had lost a wisp of spiritual sense, but it didn't affect him at all as his spiritual sense was far more powerful than that of his 2 companions. He temporarily turned his attention away from the screen and lowered his head to appraise the golden cauldron. The cauldron was shimmering with golden light, and a series of patterns that resembled clouds and mist were engraved on its surface. These patterns were extremely complex, and most of them were in a corkscrew form. They were spread over the entire cauldron, and upon closer inspection, he was struck by a sense of dizziness. Han Li's heart stirred upon seeing this, and he calmly released his spiritual sense once again, only to find that it was unable to seep into the cauldron at all. Letter 1D627, letter 1D4C7, letter 1D452, letter 1D452, letter 1D464, letter 212F, letter 1D624, letter 2134, letter 1D62E. He didn't know what kind of material the cauldron had been forged from, but it was able to completely keep out his spiritual sense. However, he had also noticed that there were 2 square indentations on the sides of the cauldrons, and they seemed to be slots that certain items could be placed into. Han Li looked on with a contemplative expression for a moment before he suddenly sensed something, and he turned his gaze toward his 2 companions, upon which his heart immediately stirred slightly. Liu Shuyer and Shi Kun were currently staring at the ancient golden cauldron with intense, unblinking eyes. To be more specific, they were staring at the square indentations on the golden cauldron, and there was an ecstatic look on Shi Kun's face. Han Li's eyes narrowed slightly, and he asked, "Do the 2 of you recognize this golden cauldron?" The elated look on Shi Kun's face receded slightly upon hearing this, and he hurriedly shook his head in response. "Surely you jest, Brother Han. This is the first time I've come here, so there's obviously no way that I would recognize anything here." "Oh, then why is it that both of you seem so interested in something you don't even recognize?" Han Li asked with a faint smile. Seeing as Han Li refused to be placated, Shi Kun decided to kick the ball into Liu Shuyer's court. "Well, why don't you ask Fairy Liu about that instead? She knows more than I do about this." Liu Shuyer was naturally quite disgruntled by Shi Kun's devious diversion tactic, but she could offer an explanation at the sight of the curious gaze that Han Li had turned to aim at her. "There's no need for you to be overly suspicious, Brother Han. This cauldron is most likely the treasure that contains the spirit void pills and the other treasures that my master and senior Duan seek. Fellow Taoist Shi and I are both aware of this as each of us is carrying an item. Fellow Taoist Shi, how about you and I bring out those items for Brother Han to see? Liu Shuyer explained. I'm really getting rather curious now, Han Li chuckled upon hearing this. A hesitant look appeared on Shi Kun's face in response to Liu Shuyer's proposal, and he felt as if he had shot himself into the foot. Is there something that you're reluctant to show me, fellow Taoist Shi? Han Li asked in a seemingly casual manner, and his tone was extremely benevolent. However, Shi Kun's heart immediately jolted at the sight of the tranquil expression on Han Li's face, and he hurriedly chuckled. Of course not. Even if you hadn't asked, I would have revealed this item anyway. After all, the two items are required to secure the treasures within the cauldron. Thus, he flipped his hand over as he spoke, and golden light flashed as an item appeared over his palm. Han Li naturally, immediately focused his gaze on the item and quickly ascertained what it was. This was also a shimmering golden object that was rectangular in shape with a dragon's head carved on one end. It resembled a seal, and after inspecting the item for a while, Han Li turned his gaze toward Liu Shuyer. Liu Shuyer is naturally aware of Han Li's intentions, and she calmly raised a hand to summon an object that was also shimmering with golden light. At first glance, this object appeared to be extremely similar in appearance with the one in Shi Kun's hand. It was around the same size and shape, but there was an extremely lifelike golden phoenix head carved on one end, as opposed to a dragon's head. A contemplative look appeared on Han Li's face after inspecting these two items. At this moment, Liu Shuyer began to offer an explanation. These two objects are known as exquisite keys, and they are the only items that can open this golden cauldron. Furthermore, both of them must be present to accomplish this. We had no knowledge of the situation in the palace prior to coming here, but my master told me that the exquisite keys can open this cauldron, so it's most likely the case that the spirit void pills are contained within the cauldron. Indeed, my master also told me the same thing. Seeing as Liu Shuyer had revealed the truth, Shi Kun no longer tried to hide anything either. In that case, why don't you two open the cauldron to see if the treasures requested by our two seniors are really in there? I wonder how many spirit void pills are in there. If there's an even number of them, the two of you two will be able to split them rather than argue over ownership, Han Li said with a nonchalant smile. Liu Shuyer and Shi Kun exchanged a glance upon hearing this, and peculiar looks appeared in both of their eyes. Brother Han is right. This cauldron will have to be opened sooner or later, so let's insert our keys, fellow Taoist Shi. It's quite likely that there's only spirit void pill in there, but if there really are two or more, then we won't need to fight over them, Liu Shuyer proposed in a calm voice. Shi Kun seemed to have also made some kind of decision, and he suddenly smirked and said something that came as a slight surprise to Liu Shuyer. I have no objections against opening the cauldron, but I think we should give our exquisite keys to Brother Han so he can secure the treasures from the cauldron, then decide how to split them among us. What do you think of that, Fairy Liu? Liu Shuyer was temporarily at a loss for how to respond. Are you doubting Brother Han's abilities? A peculiar look appeared on Shi Kun's face. Of course not. With Brother Han's unfathomable power, it would be ideal for him to secure the treasures for us. Brother Han, please accept my exquisite key. Liu Shuyer reacted quite quickly, and after quickly contemplating the situation, she immediately smiled and made a decision, raising a hand to toss her exquisite key toward Han Li. Shi Kun also chuckled coldly, before tossing his key toward Han Li without any hesitation. Han Li swept a sleeve through the air, and azure light flashed, upon which both of the exquisite keys appeared in his hand at once. However, a wry smile appeared on his face as he inspected the pair of keys. You two sure have a high opinion of me. Haha, of course. Only by asking you to secure the treasures in our stead will Fairy Liu and I be able to avoid immediate conflict. Otherwise, neither of us will trust the other to secure the treasures, Shi Kun chuckled. I also have full trust in Brother Han. Liu Shuyer's eyes flashed as a smile appeared on her face. I'm honored to receive your trust, but it's also quite a heavy burden. Han Li appraised the two keys as he shook his head in a resigned manner. However, he didn't return the keys to Shi Kun and Liu Shuyer. After a brief moment of contemplation, he really did make his way over to the golden cauldron. He was acting in such a calm and collected manner naturally because he was confident that he possessed more than enough power to dominate these two. In the face of absolute power, there really wasn't much any of them could do. Tense looks appeared in both Liu Shuya and Shi Kun's eyes upon seeing this, but both of them acted quite wisely and remained on the spot. After Han Li reached about 10 feet away from the cauldron, he stopped again before glancing at the two indentations on either side of the cauldron. Immediately thereafter, he injected his magic power into the two keys in his hand before flicking his wrist. The exquisite keys shot forth, letting loose a clear cry along the way before transforming into a golden worm and a golden phoenix amid a flash of golden light. The two of them revolved around the golden cauldron before flying into the indentations, then vanishing into the cauldron in a flash. Immediately thereafter, the two indentations on the cauldron were filled with unerring accuracy. The two exquisite keys were completely embedded into the cauldron, with only the dragon and phoenix heads revealed. They fit seamlessly into the indentations without any gaps to be seen. In the instant that the pair of keys entered the golden cauldron, a melodious dragon's roar suddenly rang out. Brilliant golden light then erupted, and the corkscrew patterns on the surface of the cauldron began to revolve as if they'd sprung to life. Even the golden light being emitted by the cauldron began to take on a peculiar vortex form, and Han Li was struck by a sense of disorientation at the sight of this golden vortex, as if he were going to be drawn directly into it. His heart immediately jolted in response, but he wasn't actually fearful toward the cauldron as there was no one wielding it, so it surely posed no threat to him. He hurriedly activated his great development technique, and at the same time, blue light flashed through his eyes, upon which his discomfort was instantly alleviated in its entirety. All of a sudden, he let loose a low cry before making a hand seal, and an azure incantation seal shot forth before vanishing into the cauldron in a flash. In the next instant, the dragon's roar that was being released by the cauldron transformed into the delightful cry of a phoenix. From a distance, it appeared as if the dragon and phoenix heads on either side of the golden cauldron had begun to move, as if they had sprung to life. The scintillating golden lid of the cauldron rose up into the air before disappearing into nothingness. A loud commotion then rang out from within the cauldron, and following a rumbling boom, several golden balls of light of different sizes shot forth before attempting to escape into the heavens. However, Han Li was already prepared well in advance, so he certainly wasn't going to let these items slip through his fingers. As such, he immediately swept a sleeve forward, and gray light surged forth like lightning, instantly enveloping all of the golden balls of light at once. However, these golden balls of light suddenly dispersed, and the gray light receded in their paths, posing no impediment to them at all. Han Li was rather alarmed to see this, and he immediately made a hand seal before opening his mouth to expel a ball of azure light. There was a miniature azure cauldron within the azure light, and it was none other than his heaven-void cauldron. Letter 1D65B, letter 1D4FB, letter 1D486, letter 1D486, letter 1D498, letter 1D65A, letter 1D658, letter 1D664, letter 1D662. His hand shot forth as a blur and struck the side of the cauldron, upon which its lid flew off of its own accord. Immediately thereafter, a plume of azure threads erupted forth before dispersing through the air. The countless green threads intertwined to form a giant azure net that encompassed all of the golden balls of light beneath it. As soon as the golden balls of light struck the net, they were all repelled back, and Han Li made another hand seal before pointing up into the air. The huge azure net abruptly folded in on itself, and all of the golden balls of light were trapped within it, thereby completely immobilizing them. Only then did Han Li calmly wave a hand through the air, and the azure threads instantly began to radiate dazzling light, causing Liu Shuya and Shi Kun to blink involuntarily as they looked on with rapt focus. The azure net that contained the golden balls of light transformed into a streak of azure light that flew downward, then disappeared into the small cauldron in a flash. The azure cauldron lid then immediately descended to seal the heaven-void cauldron shut. Han Li made a grabbing motion toward the small cauldron, and azure light immediately flashed, following which the treasure appeared in his hand. After that, he carried the treasure in one hand before turning around to face his two companions. Fellow Taoists, the treasures have been secured. You two will have to inspect them in person to see if they include the treasures that our two seniors have requested. As soon as his voice trailed off, he flicked his wrist again, and the heaven-void cauldron rose up into the air before hovering in a stationary manner before him. He then crossed his arms and appraised his two companions with a hint of a smile on his face. Liu Shuya and Shi Kun exchanged a glance upon hearing this, but Liu Shuya then immediately chuckled before giving a nod and made her way gracefully over to the cauldron. Shikun rubbed his own chin and glanced at the azure cauldron before also striding toward it. The two of them then stopped around 10 feet away from the cauldron, and before they had even said anything, Han Li waved a hand forward in a calm manner. The small azure cauldron immediately rotated on the spot, and its lid vanished once again, revealing a burst of azure light flashing incessantly within it. "Brother Han, this is a spirit treasure, is it not? Does it have a name?" Shikun suddenly asked. "Are you interested in this spirit treasure, brother Shi?" Han Li's expression remained completely unchanged as he replied with a question of his own. "Not exactly. It's just that I was fortunate enough to have seen a replica copy of the chaotic myriad spirit roll in our stone cocoon race, and there seemed to be an item on it that was very similar to your cauldron," Shikun explained. "The chaotic myriad spirit roll." Han Li reflexively furrowed his brows slightly. "Have you not heard of it, brother Han?" Shikun was rather taken aback. "I've naturally heard of it, but those are all rumors, and I don't really know the exact details of the roll. It would be great if you two could enlighten me on the subject," Han Li replied with a contemplative expression. "It's actually pretty simple. All of the races that have taken over a certain territory in the spirit realm have had a strange rock fall upon their land, and the chaotic myriad spirit roll is inscribed upon those rocks. The roll keeps a record of all of the most powerful treasures in the spirit realm, and it's constantly being updated. Every single item on the roll is quite extraordinary, and even divine spirit treasures are all ranked quite low on the list. I recall that I just so happened to have seen a treasure on the roll's replica copy that bore a resemblance to this cauldron of yours, but it was ranked rather low, so I didn't pay much attention to it. As such, it's quite possible that my memory is merely playing tricks on me," Shikun explained in an honest manner. "I'm not sure if this item is the one that you're referring to. Perhaps it is, perhaps it's not. However, that's not the pressing matter at hand. We should focus on inspecting the items in the cauldron to see if the treasures requested by our two seniors are among them," Han Li said with a smile. Seeing as Han Li was clearly dodging the question, Shikun naturally couldn't keep pressing the issue, and he made no attempt to raise further questions as he nodded in response. As for Liu Shuyer, her gaze had been fixed on the heaven-void cauldron this entire time, and following the conclusion of Han Li and Shikun's conversation, she immediately said, "Please reveal the treasures to us, brother Han. Spirit void pills are very easy to identify, so we definitely won't be mistaking them." She seemed to be more interested in the treasures in the cauldron than Shikun was. Han Li naturally had no objections to this, and he swept a sleeve through the air, sending several formation flags hurtling forth before disappearing into the surrounding space as streaks of light of different colors. All of a sudden, a white light barrier appeared to encompass an area with a radius of over 100 feet around the heaven-void cauldron. This was a simple restriction formation, and it had naturally been set up to prevent any mishaps from occurring after the treasures were revealed. Liu Shuyer and Shikun took a brief glance at the light barrier before paying it no further heed. This restriction could be easily broken by them, and they had no reason to suspect that Han Li harbored any ulterior motives. After the formation was set up, Han Li cast his gaze toward the small cauldron in the air before opening his mouth to expel a burst of azure light. The azure light swept over the cauldron, and a rumbling noise rang out from within amid flashes of azure light. Liu Shuyer and Shikun both looked on with bated breath. Meanwhile, Han Li wore a relaxed smile as he raised a hand before pointing a finger at the small azure cauldron. The cauldron was only around a foot in size initially, but it then immediately expanded to around 10 feet in height. Han Li then immediately made another hand seal, and a dull thump rang out, following which a ball of light suddenly flew out of the cauldron. The ball of light was only around the size of a human fist, but it was bound tightly by countless azure threads, which were pulsating slightly. Han Li let loose a low cry before raising a hand, and an incantation seal flew through the air before vanishing into the ball of light. Immediately thereafter, the azure threads around the ball of light were shattered before vanishing as specks of azure light. As soon as the azure threads faded, golden light flashed, and the item attempted to fly away again. A cold light flashed through Han Li's eyes, and he immediately reached out with a single hand. An enormous burst of invisible force instantly descended, and the item was completely immobilized in midair. Han Li focused his gaze on the item to find that it was a shimmering golden gourd. There were complex patterns all over its surface, and spiritual light was flashing erratically from it. Liu Shuyer and Shikun's expressions changed slightly upon seeing this, but they didn't do anything in response. Han Li made a pulling motion with his hand, and the golden gourd immediately hurtled toward him before landing in his grasp. It seemed to have attained a hint of spiritual nature, and was trembling incessantly within his hand in an attempt to break free. Han Li raised an eyebrow before sweeping a sleeve over the gourd, and white light flashed as a white talisman was adhered onto its surface. The restrictive force of the talisman immediately stifled the light emanating from the gourd, and it fell completely still. Han Li raised his hand in a calm manner and brought the gourd up to his eye level for further inspection. Blue light flashed through his eyes, and he swept a wisp of his own spiritual sense toward the treasure. After a full 10 minutes had passed, the spiritual light in Han Li's eyes faded, and he tossed the gourd forward. The item immediately flew through the air as a ball of golden light, then came to an abrupt halt between Liu Shuyer and Shikun, where it hovered in midair in a stationary manner. This is not a spirit medicine container, but a rare metal attribute treasure instead. Not only does the gourd itself seem to possess some abilities, it's nurturing several flying swords within it, although I can't determine the power of these swords. In that case, this must be a sword gourd that has only been around in ancient times. I've heard that the refinement method for this type of treasure had already faded into complete obscurity on all of the continents. I'm very intrigued to inspect this treasure for myself. Fellow Taoist Shi, you wouldn't mind if I took a look at the treasure first, would you? Liu Shuyer suddenly asked as she turned to Shikun with a smile. He, of course not. You can go right ahead, Shikun chuckled in a nonchalant manner. Liu Shuyer smiled before waving a slender hand through the air, and the golden gourd immediately descended obediently before falling into her palm. She released her spiritual sense and began to carefully inspect the item, but after just a short while, she shook her head and tossed it toward Shikun. A hint of disappointment appeared on Shikun's face upon seeing her reaction, but he was still unwilling to give up on the item as he also began to inspect it with rapt focus. After a short while, Shikun also heaved a slightly disappointed sigh. This really is a metal attribute treasure, and the fact that it was placed in this golden cauldron most likely indicates that it's quite powerful. What arrangement do we think should be made surrounding this treasure, fellow Taoists? Liu Shuyer turned toward Han Li and chuckled. Seeing as it's not one of the treasures requested by my master and elder Duan, why don't we give it to Brother Han for safekeeping for now? We'll decide on how to split the treasures when all of them have been revealed. Shikun pondered this proposal for a moment before nodding in response and tossing the gourd back to Han Li. I have no objections to Fairy Liu's suggestion. Seeing as our two seniors haven't requested this treasure, Brother Han can keep it in his possession for now. In that case, I would be happy to oblige. Han Li made no effort to refuse, and he swept a sleeve through the air to expel a burst of azure light, which engulfed the golden gourd before dragging it into his sleeve. He then cast another incantation seal toward the heaven-void cauldron, and azure light flashed from within as another object that was bound by azure threads emerged. Han Li withdrew the azure threads again, and the treasure that was revealed within was an azure jade box with flashing golden runes on its surface. The jade box was drawn into Han Li's grasp, and both Liu Shuyer and Shikun's demeanors clearly shifted at the sight of it as they stared at it with intense, unblinking eyes. Han Li didn't play any tricks and blew a burst of spiritual qi toward the jade box right in front of his two companions. The lid was removed, and Han Li's expression changed slightly after glancing at the contents of the box. There were two identical miniature green horses within the box, each of which was around the size of an egg and emanating a rich medicinal aroma. Just a single light whiff of this aroma sent a burst of pure spiritual qi surging throughout his body, but the two miniature horses were lying completely still in the box with their eyes closed, having lost all signs of life long ago. The two miniature horses rose up out of the box at Han Li's behest before flying toward Liu Shuyer and Shikun. At the same time, he said in a calm voice, "These two spirit medicines must be the jade-curd herbs that our two seniors have referred to, right? Who would have thought that they're capable of metamorphosis already? I'm sure they'll be very useful to our two seniors. Seeing as there are two of them, why don't you take one each?" Liu Shuyer and Shikun were ecstatic to hear this, but they were also slightly disappointed at the sight of the pair of extremely lifelike, yet completely lifeless miniature horses. However, in any case, the fact that Han Li had offered them such precious spirit medicines without any hesitation alleviated the final hint of concern they had harbored toward him. Shikun expressed his gratitude toward Han Li before drawing one of the miniature horses into his grasp, then briefly inspected it before carefully stowing it away into a jade box of his own. Liu Shuyer was also very pleased with the spirit medicine, and she expressed her gratitude toward Han Li as well before stowing it away up her sleeve. Han Li nodded expressionlessly in response to their expressions of gratitude, then tossed the jade box onto the ground. He was doing so to show the two of them that the box was indeed empty and that there were no other spirit medicines contained within it. After that, he continued to summon treasures out of the heaven-void cauldron. The next two items to emerge from the cauldron were a hexagonal formation plate and a shimmering golden pagoda. It was quite clear that these two were unfathomably powerful treasures, and they were temporarily given to Han Li for safekeeping as well. The next treasure to emerge from the cauldron was another one that Kai Liting and Duan Tianren had requested, so Han Li split it up evenly between his two companions. Liu Shuyer's eyes flashed, and a hint of concern appeared on her face. Shikun's expression had also darkened slightly. They could see that there weren't many golden balls of light left in Han Li's cauldron, yet they still hadn't seen any spirit void pills yet, so they were starting to grow rather uneasy. No matter how many other treasures they obtained, their trip would still be considered a failure if they couldn't secure the all-important spirit void pills. Right at this moment, a low ringing sound rang out from the giant azure cauldron, and another treasure was expelled. The azure threads dispersed to reveal a small purple vial that was only several inches tall, but its surface as smooth as a mirror, and there were wisps of white qi revolving around it. A burst of astonishing spiritual qi emanated from the small vial, and expressions of elation appeared on both Shikun and Liu Shuyer's faces. Han Li cast an expressionless gaze toward the purple vial, which was slowly rotating in midair, and he stroked his chin as the corners of his lips curled upward slightly. All of a sudden, he raised an arm before pointing forward, and the lid of the purple vial suddenly flew off of its own accord. The opening of the vial was then tipped upside down, and a golden ball of spirit flames emerged from within. The spirit flames let loose a clear cry, before transforming into a fiery golden bird. As soon as the fiery bird appeared, it immediately let loose a clear cry up into the heavens. Han Li took a deep breath before extending a pristine white hand out of one of his sleeves, then curled back his 5 fingers before flicking them in succession. 5 bursts of glacial flames shot forth one after another before striking fiery golden bird in a flash, severely dimming the light that was emanating from it. After all 5 bursts of glacial flames had struck the golden bird, it let loose an anguished cry, and the golden flames completely receded to reveal a golden pill. The pill was only around the size of a human thumb, and there were complex pill patterns all over its surface. Its vibrant golden color coupled with those patterns presented quite a remarkable sight to behold. There's no mistaking it, this is definitely a spirit void pill, Liu Shuyer exclaimed with an elated look on her face as soon as the pill emerged. Shikun was also appraising the pill with excitement in his eyes, but a thought then suddenly occurred to him, and his expression changed slightly as he asked, "Brother Han, is there only one spirit void pill in the vial?" Han Li offered no reply to this question. Instead, he merely pointed a finger at the small purple vial, and it shuddered before another fiery golden bird flew out from within it amid a dull thump. "There are 2 pills. This is fantastic." Shikun immediately burst into elated laughter upon seeing this. "Seeing as both seniors have requested this pill and there just so happen to be 2 of them, you can take one each. Do either of you have any objections?" Han Li asked with a meaningful smile on his face. Liu Shuyer and Shikun's expressions both changed slightly upon seeing this, and the two of them quickly exchanged a glance. A serious look appeared on Shikun's face, and Liu Shuyer looked back at him with a cold expression. Shikun hesitated momentarily before heaving a long sigh. "All right, I'll settle for this arrangement. My master strictly ordered me to bring back all of the spirit void pills here to him, but seeing as Fair Liu is unwilling to back down, I have no choice but to compromise." "I have no objections either. At the very least, I won't be returning empty-handed to my master," Liu Shuyer chimed in as the cold look in her eyes eased slightly. Seeing as both sides had agreed to this arrangement, albeit in a begrudging manner, Han Li nodded before pointing at the 2 pills in the air. The 2 golden pills shot forth before arriving in front of Liu Shuyer and Shikun in a flash. Liu Shuyer raised a hand to catch the pill that was flying toward her, while Shikun suddenly opened his mouth to expel a burst of yellow light, which instantly swept up the pill. Only then did he calmly extricate the pill from within the yellow light. Even though both of them were convinced that these were spirit void pills, this was an extremely important matter, so they naturally still had to use their own secret techniques for verification. Thus, one of them began to chant incantations and cast strings of incantation seals toward the spirit pill that they were holding. Meanwhile, the other merely stared intently at the pill in their hand. After about 10 minutes, both of them looked up at once before exchanging a glance and a nod, upon which they heaved a collective sigh of relief. "We must offer you our gratitude, Brother Han. Without your assistance, there would have been no way for us to reach this place so quickly and secure the spirit void pills," Liu Shuyer said with a smile as she stowed her pill away into a vial that she was carrying. "I accepted benefits from our two seniors, so it's only right for me to repay them," Han Li replied in a nonchalant manner. Shikan also stowed away his pill before casting his gaze toward the purple vial that was hovering in midair, and he suddenly asked, "You're far too modest, Brother Han. Forgive me for my rudeness, but I must ask if there are any other pills inside that vial." Liu Shuyer's heart stirred upon hearing this, and a peculiar look flashed through her eyes. I didn't think that fellow Taoist she would be so greedy. You can take a look for yourself to see if there are any other pills in here." Han Li chuckled before casting an incantation seal, and the purple vial immediately flew toward Shikan as a streak of light. Shikan could hear a hint of displeasure in Han Li's voice, but this was too important a matter for him to risk overlooking any details, so he pretended to be oblivious to Han Li's attitude as he caught the vial before sweeping his spiritual sense toward it. However, the vial was completely empty, and there were no other pills within it. A hint of disappointment flashed through Shikan's heart, but he disguised it with a smile as he turned to Liu Shuyer. "Would you like to have a look as well, Fairy Liu?" He motioned to toss the vial toward her as he spoke. However, Liu Shuyer merely shook her head and said, "Brother Han and Brother She have already inspected the vial, so there's no need for me to take another look. I trust the two of you." Shikan naturally couldn't force the issue, so he could only offer Han Li a sheepish smile before tossing the vial back to him. Han Li's expression remained unchanged, but he swept a sleeve through the air to accept the purple vial nonetheless. After that, Han Li extricated two more items out of the cauldron, both of which were rare materials that were virtually extinct in the spirit realm, and they were also among the items requested by Kai Living and Duan Tianren. Due to the fact that there was only one of each item, Liu Shuyer and Shikan took one each, and no disputes took place. Thus, aside from the first three treasures to have emerged from the cauldron, all of the other items had been reserved for the two seniors. There were no more items in the cauldron, and Shikan didn't express any doubts on this occasion. After all, there really were no further balls of golden light within the Heaven Void Cauldron. After Han Li stowed away his Heaven Void Cauldron, Liu Shuyer smiled and said, "Brother Han, the first three treasures from the cauldron are outside of the treasures requested by my master and senior Duan, so let's split them among us." "Haha, it's a good thing that there were three treasures. We'll be able to take one each. You can go ahead and take the first pick, Brother Han," Shikan offered. Liu Shuyer faltered initially upon hearing this, but she then quickly agreed to this arrangement with a smile. After all, it made sense for Han Li to take the first pick. On top of that, there was no way to ascertain the abilities of the three treasures through inspecting them visually or using one's spiritual sense, so it didn't really matter in which order they took their picks. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face upon hearing this, and the said, "All right, in that case, I'd be more than happy to oblige. I've already chosen a treasure. You two can split the remaining two treasures." Han Li swept a sleeve through the air as he spoke, and two items immediately flew out before hovering in front of him. These were none other than the golden pagoda and the hexagonal formation plate, which meant that he had chosen the golden gourd. Liu Shuyer and Shikan were both slightly surprised by Han Li's choice, but they didn't pay much heed to it. Instead, they both turned their attention toward the remaining two treasures with contemplative looks on their faces. Liu Shuyer was the first to speak. "I would like the golden pagoda. If you have objections, you can have the formation plate. What do you think, Brother Shi?" Shikan hesitated momentarily but still nodded in agreement in the end. "All right, I'll take the formation place then." "Thank you for allowing me to choose ahead of you, Brother Shi." Liu Shuyer smiled before raising a hand, and the golden pagoda treasure in front of Han Li was drawn into her grasp. Shikan naturally also drew the hexagonal formation plate to himself as well. The three of them exchanged a glance with one another, and all of them were quite elated. "Brother Han, Fairy Liu, you wouldn't object if I were to take this golden cauldron, would you?" Shikan suddenly strode toward the cauldron with a smile on his face. He then laid a hand on it, and bright spiritual light abruptly radiated from it. Immediately thereafter, the cauldron shrank down to around the size of a human fist in the blink of an eye. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this, but his expression then instantly eased as he said, "I have no objections. If Fairy Liu is also willing to accept this arrangement, then you can go right ahead. This cauldron is a fantastic treasure for holding some important things, and I also wanted it for myself, but seeing brother she has already claimed it, I'm willing to pass up on it." There was a hint of disappointment in Liu Xuyer's eyes as she appraised the golden cauldron, but Kun had already claimed it, so she had no choice but to comply. After all, this wasn't something worth instigating a potential conflict over. Kun chuckled as he stuffed the golden cauldron up his sleeve, then looked around to find that Han Li was currently carefully appraising that peculiar screen. "Have you discovered something, Brother Han?" Kun couldn't help but ask at the sight of Han Li's enraptured expression. "This is no ordinary screen," Han Li gave a completely pointless reply. Kun was left feeling rather speechless upon hearing this. The fact that this screen was able to devour their spiritual sense clearly indicated that this was no ordinary item, so such a response told him nothing that he didn't already know. However, it wouldn't be appropriate for him to pry any further, so he could only also inspect the screen using secret techniques of his own. Meanwhile, Liu Xuyer had also strode over to the screen and was appraising it with a contemplative look on her face. Right at this moment, Han Li's body swayed, and he suddenly appeared behind the screen. He raised both of his hands and flicked his 10 fingers in succession, upon which incantation seals of different colors were sent hurtling toward the screen. Kun and Liu Xuyer were naturally intrigued by what Han Li was doing and hurriedly cast their eyes toward him. Right at this moment, Han Li let loose a low cry, and a ball of black chi suddenly appeared on his glabella. An inky black third eye then emerged before blasting forth a pillar of black light that was around as thick as a human thumb onto the screen. Immediately thereafter, a buzzing sound rang out from behind the screen, and a vast expanse of 7 colored lights surged forth. The light swept up Han Li, and he abruptly vanished on the spot. Kun and Liu Xuyer's hearts jostled upon seeing this, and they immediately rushed around to the rear of the screen in unison. There, they discovered that a string of ancient purple text had appeared on the screen. "World within the screen." Liu Xuyer's pupils contracted slightly as she read the words aloud. Almost at the exact same moment, Han Li had already been teleported into a strange space. Everything around him was nothing more than a vast expanse of murky grayness, with the exception of a massive black gate that was situated nearby. There were countless golden and silver runes hovering all over the gate, and they were constantly fluctuating in brightness, creating quite a mysterious sight to behold. This gate was identical to the one that was on the screen from earlier, and it was as if he had been swept up into the artwork on the screen. This really is a place that's similar to the Zumi paradise. Han Li looked around at his surroundings before turning his gaze toward the giant gate, upon which a peculiar look appeared on his face. All of a sudden, he flipped a hand over, and spiritual light flashed as a stack of formation. Plates of different colors appeared over his palm. He then made a hand seal with his other hand, and all of the formation plates shot forth at his behest, flying away in all directions. The formation plates transformed into balls of light that plummeted downward, and as soon as they came into contact with the ground, they vanished without a trace. Moments later, bursts of white mist began to surge out of the spots where the formation plates had vanished in a frenzy. The mist was dense and lingered in the air for a long time, forming an extremely viscous wall of mist that encompassed both Han Li and the massive gate before him. Only then did Han Li's expression ease slightly, and he swept a sleeve through the air to release a ball of azure light, which contained an item. The item circled around through the air before hovering in front of him, and it was none other than his heaven-void cauldron. He pointed a finger gently at the cauldron, and its lid flew off on its own. Azure light flashed within the cauldron, and a faint white figure emerged. This was a little girl in a white dress. She appeared to be around 6 or 7 years old with her hair arranged into small braids, and her round little face was extremely adorable. It was none other than Quer. Quer pays her respects to her master. She extended a salute toward Han Li with a cheeky smile on her face. "Well done. Even I wasn't able to sense your aura from within the cauldron. There's no way that those two would have been able to detect your presence," Han Li praised with a pleased look on his face. "It's all thanks to the treasure and talisman you gave me, master. Otherwise, There's no way that my abilities alone would have been able to fool those two top-grade spatial tempering stage beings. Quirr giggled in response. As soon as her voice trailed off, black light flashed, and a large black veil flew off her body. At the same time, she made a grabbing motion with one hand, and a high zenith invisibility talisman was revealed. Quirr held the two items with both of her little hands, as if she were returning them to Han Li. There's no need to return them to me. You're adept in concealment and movement techniques anyway, so those two treasures are better suited to serve you. Even if I were to use those two treasures, I may not be able to completely conceal myself from those two at just close quarters. Besides, I have other treasures that serve a similar purpose, so you can keep those, Han Li said with a nonchalant wave of his hand. In that case, I'd be more than happy to oblige. Quirr's smile widened even further as she patted the black veil and talisman against her own body, upon which they abruptly vanished. Han Li smiled upon seeing this before adopting a more serious expression. Back when I was securing the treasures within the golden cauldron, I intentionally made the spiritual light brighter to act as a smokescreen so I could send you into the heaven-void cauldron without being noticed. However, not much time passed before the cauldron was open again. Did you have enough time to strike? I'm super quick. Look, master. A smug smile appeared on Quirr's face, and she flipped over one of her little hands to reveal a shimmering golden pill. Well done. Han Li had already guessed that Quirr had most likely accomplished her mission, but he was still quite elated at the sight of this pill. He waved a hand, and the golden pill drifted out of Quirr's grasp before landing in his hand. He carefully appraised it several times before he was finally able to determine that this was indeed identical to the other two spirit void pills. He didn't know what specific effect this pill had, but the fact that both Kai Ling and Duan Tianren were so eager to get their hands on these pills was sufficient testament to how precious they were. You told me not to touch those other treasures and only pay attention to medicine vials, so I only had time to tip a single pill out of that vial. You also told me that I could take a pill if there had been more than one pill in the vial, and I followed those instructions. Otherwise, I would have taken the other two pills as well. Quirr pouted her little red lips in a rather wistful display. And Li couldn't help but burst into laughter upon hearing this. You're being a little too greedy. It's already vastly fortunate that we were able to steal a spirit void pill right under those two's noses. If we had tried anything else, we would have aroused their suspicion. It's a good thing that there were still two pills remaining in the vial aside from this one. Otherwise, the situation would have become very troublesome. Perhaps we would have had no choice but to relinquish this pill. I don't want to be hunted by a pair of enraged body integration stage beings here in this foreign land, Han Li explained with a smile, then swept a hand over his storage bracelet to summon the small purple vial from before. He placed the pill into the vial, then adhered several restriction talismans onto it before carefully stowing it away. You must have your reasons, master, but I still think it's quite a pity that we had to spare those two pills to them. Quirr was still looking rather forlorn. Han Li shook his head with an amused smile, but a thought then suddenly occurred to him, and swept a sleeve through the air to summon a series of flying daggers, each of which was only around an inch in length. All of the daggers were as thin as paper and shimmering with a cold light, and there were around 300 to 400 of them in total. Master, what are you? Quirr was rather perplexed. These flying daggers were refined from the wings of that monstrous moth we encountered last time. There are 360 of them in total, and you seem to be missing a treasure that you can use to defend yourself, so I'll give these daggers to you. They can't compare with top-tier treasures like divine spirit treasures, but if you can refine all of them, then they'll be more than enough to protect you against average opponents. This will be your reward for your brilliant efforts. Han Li made a grabbing motion as he spoke, and all of the flying daggers in the air immediately flew toward him. They compiled themselves into two thick stacks in the blink of an eye before landing in his hand, and Han Li smiled as he offered them to Quirr. Thank you for your kindness, master. Quirr was ecstatic, and her body swayed as she vanished on the spot. In the next instant, she appeared right in front of Han Li and accepted the flying daggers in an elated manner. All right, as a safety precaution, you should return to your true body and refine these flying daggers. Don't appear unless I summon you so you don't get revealed to anyone else, Han Li instructed in a serious manner. Yes, master, I'll be sure to cultivate in peace. Quirr naturally accepted this arrangement, and she made a hand seal, upon which she and all of the flying daggers vanished up Han Li's sleeve as a ball of white light in a flash. Han Li exhaled upon seeing this, and only then did he cast his gaze toward the giant gate in the distance with a contemplative look on his face. Meanwhile, Shikun and Liu Shuyer were still situated in the main palace, appraising the screen before them with hesitant looks on their faces. The azure light on the surface of the screen had already completely faded, thereby revealing the artwork on it. However, a layer of cloud and mist had then appeared over the image, making it impossible to see the massive gate. A dozen or so yellow formation flags had appeared around the screen, and all of them were flashing with faint yellow light. The screen sat right at the center of the circle of flags, and a rather profound formation had been established. There were still faint spatial fluctuations lingering in the air above the formation, and 2 or 3 shimmering treasures were slowly revolving around Shikun and Liu Shuyer. "What do you propose we do, Fairy Liu? We've already used several powerful treasures, yet have still been unable to break this restriction around the screen, so it's clearly not something that we can break through in a short time. Speaking of which, how did fellow Taoist Han manage to enter the screen? He seemed to have done so quite easily," Shikun sighed. Liu Shuyer was silent for a moment before asking, "Haven't you noticed, brother Shi?" "Noticed what?" Shikun was rather perplexed. "Don't you think the third eye that appeared on fellow Taoist Han's glabella really resembles a certain legendary object?" Liu Shuyer continued. "You're saying that's a law-destruction eye?" Despite his rugged appearance, Shikun was far from unintelligent, and he instantly realized what Liu Shuyer was implying. "Aside from this legendary demonic eye, I haven't heard of any other similar ability that can easily tear through this spatial restriction and grant access into this screen," Liu Shuyer said in a calm voice. "If it really is the law-destruction eye, then we won't be able to replicate fellow Taoist Han. Unless we completely destroy this entrance, there will be no chance for us to enter the screen," Shikun murmured with tightly furrowed brows. "If we join forces and both of us are willing to expend some energy, there's indeed a chance that we could accomplish this. However, if we fail, then we'll essentially have destroyed the exit for fellow Taoist Han. I'm sure he won't be very happy about that, and when he tears through space to return to this place, we'll have to face the full brunt of his wrath. After all, with his law-destruction eye, there's no way he'll actually be trapped in there," Liu Shuyer chuckled. Shikun's expression changed slightly upon hearing this, and he cast his gaze toward the screen again as he chuckled dryly in response. "Surely you jest, Fairy Liu. I wouldn't do something so reckless and risk harming others for my own benefit. Seeing as there's no way we'll be able to break this spatial restriction in a short time, why don't we leave this place and see if there are any rewards to be reaped in the other side palaces?" "My thoughts exactly, fellow Taoist Shi," Liu Shuyer replied with an approving smile. Shikun chuckled upon seeing this before taking one final forlorn glance at the screen, before suddenly sweeping a sleeve through the air. A gust of yellow wind immediately surged out of his sleeve before sweeping up all of the weapons hanging on the wall, as well as the suits of armor lying on the ground, then drawing them back up his sleeve.